West Texas, summer of 1889. The kind of heat that didn't just burn skin. It stripped away pretense, left people raw and exposed for exactly what they were. Grace Holloway had learned that truth the hard way, standing on a dusty road with nothing but the clothes on her back and a secret growing inside her that had cost her everything she'd ever known. 15 years old, cast out by the one man who should have protected her, she understood now that mercy was not guaranteed, that righteousness could wear a cruel face, and that sometimes the people who spoke loudest about God's love knew the least about it. The sun beat down, merciless and indifferent, and Grace kept walking because stopping meant accepting that she had nowhere left to go. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The dust rose with every step, coating Grace's throat, settling into the fabric of her dress until she could taste nothing but grit and her own fear. Her feet ached inside boots that had worn thin months ago. The leather cracked and split at the seams. She had been walking since dawn, maybe longer. Time had become difficult to measure when every moment felt the same, when the sun climbed higher and the road stretched endlessly forward with no promise of shelter or rest. The landscape offered nothing. Flat scrubland dotted with mesquite and prickly pear, the occasional windmill standing stark against the pale sky. No towns, no homesteads, just the vast emptiness of West Texas summer where the heat shimmered off the ground in waves that made the horizon dance and blur. Grace wiped sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand, her fingers trembling slightly. She wasn't sure if it was exhaustion or something else, something deeper that had settled into her bones over the past 3 days. 3 days since she'd left. 3 days since her father had looked at her with eyes colder than she'd thought possible, his voice steady and final as he told her to go. She pushed the memory away, but it clung to her like the dust, refusing to be shaken loose. Her stomach cramped suddenly, a dull ache that made her pause mid-step. She pressed a hand against her belly, feeling the slight swell there that had become impossible to hide. 4 months along, maybe 5. She wasn't entirely sure. The town doctor would have known, but she'd been too afraid to ask, too terrified of the questions that would follow. And now it didn't matter anyway because there was no town, no doctor, no one who cared whether she lived or died out here on this road that led nowhere. She started walking again because stopping invited thoughts she couldn't afford to entertain. Thoughts about how young she was, how unprepared, how utterly alone. Thoughts about the baby and what kind of life awaited a child born to a girl with nothing, no family, no home, no future beyond the next mile of dirt road stretching out before her. The sun climbed higher. Grace's canteen had run dry hours ago, the last few drops barely enough to wet her lips. Her tongue felt thick in her mouth, her head beginning to pound with a rhythmic insistence that matched her footsteps. She knew the signs of heat exhaustion. Her mother had taught her that much before the fever took her 2 years back. Stay hydrated, find shade, don't push yourself too hard. Simple advice that meant nothing when there was no water, no shade, and no choice but to keep moving. A hawk circled overhead, its cry sharp and lonely. Grace watched it for a moment, envying its freedom, the way it could simply ride the thermals and go wherever it pleased. She wondered what it saw when it looked down. Just another foolish girl stumbling along a road to nowhere, maybe already half dead and too stubborn to notice. Her vision blurred at the edges. She blinked hard, trying to clear it, but the blurriness remained. The road ahead seemed to tilt slightly, the horizon wobbling in a way that had nothing to do with heat shimmer. Grace slowed, her breath coming shorter now, sharper. She needed to rest, just for a moment, just long enough to catch her breath and let the dizziness pass. But there was nowhere to rest, no trees large enough to offer real shade, no rocks to sit behind, nothing but the endless flat expanse and the sun beating down without mercy. She kept walking because the alternative, sitting down in the middle of this road and simply giving up, felt too much like surrender. And Grace Holloway had not come this far to surrender. She thought about the baby again, the small life depending on her to make it through this. It hadn't asked to be born into such circumstances, hadn't chosen a 15-year-old mother with no prospects, and no protection. The father, Grace's jaw tightened at the thought of him. Thomas Brennan, 17 and full of promises he'd never meant to keep. He'd left town 2 weeks after she told him, his family suddenly deciding to move north to Kansas. Convenient timing that no one questioned because the Brennans were respected, and Grace was just the preacher's daughter who should have known better. Should have known better. Those words had followed her everywhere in the weeks before her father cast her out. Whispered in the general store, murmured outside church, said with pursed lips and judgmental eyes by women who'd once smiled at her and men who'd once tipped their hats in respect. Should have known better, as if she'd planned this, as if she'd wanted to be 15 and pregnant and terrified. Her father had said it too, that last night in the parsonage. Said it with such disappointment, such profound disgust, that Grace had felt something inside her crack and splinter. She'd expected anger. She could have weathered anger, but the cold, measured disappointment in Reverend Josiah Holloway's eyes had been worse than any rage. The memory pushed forward, despite her attempts to suppress it. She'd been sitting in the small room off the kitchen, the one where her father prepared his sermons, when he'd called her in. He hadn't raised his voice. That was the terrible part. He'd spoken in the same calm, measured tone he used from the pulpit, as if he were delivering a sermon on moral failure rather than deciding the fate of his only child. Grace stumbled slightly, catching herself before she fell. Her legs felt weak, unreliable. She pressed on, forcing one foot in front of the other, counting steps because it gave her something to focus on besides the growing certainty that she might not make it much farther. The landscape began to change subtly. The scrubland gave way to slightly rockier terrain, low hills rising in the distance. Grace's heart lifted fractionally at the sight. Hills meant possible water, creeks that might still hold moisture even in the brutal summer heat. She adjusted her course slightly, angling toward the nearest rise. The effort cost her. Her breathing grew more labored, her vision swimming in and out of focus. The cramping in her stomach intensified. Not sharp, but persistent, a dull reminder of how precarious everything had become. She tried to remember what her mother had told her about pregnancy, the warnings and advice offered during quiet conversations that seemed a lifetime ago now. Don't strain yourself too much. Eat regular meals, stay calm and rested. All impossible luxuries now. Grace reached the base of the first hill and paused, leaning against a sun-warmed boulder. The stone radiated heat, but it was solid, real, something to anchor herself against. She closed her eyes for just a moment, letting the dizziness wash over her and recede slightly. When she opened them again, the world had steadied just enough for her to continue. The climb was gradual but exhausting in her condition. Her boots slipped on loose stones, and twice she had to stop and simply breathe, waiting for her heart to slow from its panicked gallop. But she could see the top now, could see what looked like a line of cottonwoods marking where water might be, and that possibility pulled her forward when everything else told her to stop. She thought about the town she'd left behind, San Miguel with its single main street and whitewashed church, where her father had preached every Sunday for the past decade. She'd grown up in that church, learned to read from the Bible her father kept on his desk, spent countless hours polishing pews and arranging flowers and listening to her father's voice boom out messages of salvation and redemption. The irony wasn't lost on her that the man who spoke most eloquently about forgiveness had found none for his own daughter. The memory of that final conversation burned clear and sharp despite her exhaustion. Her father sitting behind his desk, hands folded, expression carved from stone. Grace standing before him like a criminal awaiting judgment, her hands instinctively protective over her stomach even though the pregnancy barely showed yet. "You've brought shame on this house," he'd said, each word precise and cutting. "On me, on your mother's memory, on everything I've built here." Grace had tried to speak, to explain, but he'd held up one hand, silencing her. "I've spent my entire life teaching this community about righteousness, about moral living, about the consequences of sin, and now my own daughter." He trailed off, shaking his head. "I can't have you here, Grace. I can't stand at that pulpit knowing what you've done, knowing that my own family embodies the very failures I preach against. Papa, please." Grace had whispered, the word barely audible. "Don't." His voice had hardened. "You stopped being my daughter the moment you made this choice. I have a responsibility to this congregation, to my calling. I won't let your sin taint everything I've worked for." Grace shook her head sharply, dislodging the memory. It did no good to dwell on it, to replay those words over and over. Her father had made his choice, and she'd made hers by simply trying to survive what came after. She'd left the parsonage that night with a small bundle of clothes and the few coins she'd saved from helping Mrs. Patterson with her laundry. That money had run out 2 days ago, spent on bread and water from the last town she'd passed through, a place whose name she couldn't even remember now. She reached the crest of the hill and stopped, her breath catching for reasons beyond exhaustion. Below, in a shallow valley, she could see them, the cottonwoods she'd spotted from below, their leaves rustling silver-green in the breeze. And beneath them, the unmistakable glint of water, a creek cutting through the rocky soil like a promise. Grace felt tears prick at her eyes, but she blinked them back. Water meant survival, at least for another day. She started down the slope, moving faster now despite her fatigue, drawn by the sight of that creek like it was salvation itself. She was halfway down when her foot caught on a loose stone. The world tilted suddenly, violently. Grace threw out her hands instinctively, trying to catch herself, but momentum carried her forward. She hit the ground hard, the impact driving the breath from her lungs. Pain exploded through her shoulder and hip as she rolled, tumbling several feet before coming to rest against a scrubby mesquite bush. For a long moment she couldn't move, couldn't breathe, could only lie there gasping while her body screamed protest. Slowly, carefully, she pushed herself up to sitting, checking for damage. Her dress was torn at the shoulder, dust and small stones embedded in the fabric. Her hands were scraped raw, blood welling up in thin lines across her palms. But worse was the cramping in her stomach, sharper now, more insistent. Grace wrapped her arms around herself, fear flooding through her in a cold rush. Please, she thought, though she wasn't sure who she was praying to. Anymore. Please let the baby be okay. Please don't let this be the thing that ends everything. She sat there for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, waiting to see if the cramping would worsen, if something catastrophic would follow. When nothing did, when the pain gradually subsided to a dull ache, she exhaled shakily and forced herself to stand. The creek was close now, maybe 50 yards away. Grace limped toward it, each step a small victory. When she finally reached the water's edge, she dropped to her knees and cupped her hands, bringing the cool water to her lips. It tasted of minerals and earth, but it was the most beautiful thing she'd ever experienced. She drank until her stomach hurt, then splashed water on her face and neck, letting it run down inside the collar of her dress. The relief was immediate and profound. For the first time in days, Grace felt something besides desperation. She felt the faint, fragile possibility that she might actually survive this. But survival required more than water. It required shelter, food, a place to rest while her body recovered from the fall and the endless walking. Grace looked around, taking in her surroundings with clearer eyes now that the immediate crisis of thirst had passed. The cottonwoods offered shade, and the creek meant she could stay here for a little while at least. But then what? Where would she go when she had to move on? She had no plan beyond the next moment, no destination in mind. She'd been heading roughly west because that seemed as good a direction as any, because west meant frontier, meant places where people didn't ask too many questions about where you came from or why you were alone. But West Texas was vast, and frontier towns were scattered far apart, and Grace was beginning to understand just how small and vulnerable she was in this landscape that cared nothing for her survival. The sun had passed its peak and begun its slow descent toward evening. Grace knew she should move, should try to cover more ground while the heat lessened, but exhaustion had settled into her bones like lead. She found a spot beneath the largest cottonwood where the roots had created a natural hollow in the bank, and she curled up there, pulling her torn dress close around her. Just a few minutes, she told herself, just enough to rest her eyes and let her body recover from the fall. Then she'd get up, she'd keep moving, she'd figure out what came next. But the shade was cool and the sound of the creek was soothing, and Grace's eyes closed despite her intentions. Sleep pulled at her with insistent fingers, and she was too tired, too worn down to fight it. She dreamed of the parsonage, of her mother's voice, singing hymns while she worked in the kitchen. She dreamed of being small again, young enough that the world still made sense, that her father's approval seemed certain and unshakable. She dreamed of safety, of belonging, of all the things she'd lost and might never find again. When she woke, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. Grace sat up slowly, her body stiff and aching from sleeping on the hard ground. The creek still burbled quietly nearby, and for a moment she simply listened to it, letting the sound anchor her in the present. Then she heard something else, footsteps, careful and deliberate, approaching from upstream. Grace's heart jumped into her throat. She pressed herself back against the tree trunk, trying to make herself small, invisible. Out here, alone and vulnerable, any encounter with another person could be dangerous. She thought of stories she'd heard, of women traveling alone who'd met with violence, of girls who'd disappeared and were never heard from again. The footsteps grew closer. Grace held her breath, every muscle tense. Through the gathering twilight, she could make out a figure, tall, broad-shouldered, moving with the easy confidence of someone who knew this land. A man. Grace's hands curled into fists, her nails digging into her already scraped palms. She had nowhere to run, no weapon to defend herself with. All she could do was wait and hope that whoever this was, whatever he wanted, she could somehow survive it. The man emerged into the small clearing by the creek, and Grace got her first clear look at him. He was older, maybe in his 40s, with grey threading through dark hair and weathered features that spoke of years spent working outdoors. He wore simple clothes, a worn shirt, canvas pants, boots that had seen better days. A rifle was slung across his back, but his hands were empty, held slightly away from his body in a gesture that seemed almost deliberately non-threatening. He stopped when he saw her, his eyes taking in her torn dress, her scraped hands, the way she was pressed back against the tree like a cornered animal. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then the man nodded once, a brief acknowledgement of her presence. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet, measured, with none of the aggression Grace had braced herself for. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. You hurt? Grace's voice came out smaller than she intended. I'm fine. The man's eyes, grey, she noticed, like storm clouds, flicked to her scraped palms, the tear in her dress, the dirt smudged across her face. He didn't contradict her obvious lie. Instead, he shifted his weight slightly, making himself less imposing. Creek's good water, he said. Safe to drink. Grace nodded, unsure what else to do. The man studied her for another moment, then turned his attention to the darkening sky. Gets cold out here at night? You got somewhere to be? The question hung in the air between them. Grace's throat tightened. She should lie, should tell him she was meeting someone, that people were expecting her. But the exhaustion, the fear, the sheer weight of the past 3 days pressed down on her, and she found she didn't have the energy for deception. No, she whispered. The man nodded as if this was exactly what he'd expected. He unslung the rifle from his shoulder, and Grace tensed, but he simply propped it against a nearby tree, well out of immediate reach. Then he crouched down by the creek, cupping water in his hands and drinking. There's a homestead about 2 miles north, he said, not looking at her. Mine. Got spare room? Food if you're hungry? He paused. No expectations, just offering. Grace stared at him, her mind racing through possibilities, dangers, outcomes. Everything she'd been taught told her not to trust strange men, not to accept help that might come with conditions she couldn't afford to meet. But everything she'd been taught had also included the certainty that her father would protect her, that family was supposed to matter, and look how that had turned out. Why? The word escaped before she could stop it. The man straightened, wiping his hands on his pants. He met her eyes directly. Because you look about half dead, and I got a spare room going to waste. It wasn't reassurance exactly. It wasn't a promise that everything would be fine. It was just a plain statement of fact, delivered without flourish or obvious ulterior motive. And somehow that plainness made it easier to believe than any passionate declaration would have been. Grace's hand moved unconsciously to her stomach. The baby. She had to think about the baby. Pride was a luxury she couldn't afford anymore. All right, she said quietly. The man nodded once more, then gestured upstream. "This way. Can you walk?" Grace pushed herself up from the tree roots, her legs unsteady but functional. Yes, they walked in silence as the last light bled from the sky. The man, he still hadn't offered his name and Grace hadn't asked, kept his pace slow, adjusted to her limping gait without drawing attention to it. The rifle remained slung across his back, his hands empty and visible. Small gestures, but Grace noted them all, cataloguing every detail in case she needed to run. But even as she walked, even as part of her mind stayed alert for danger, another part drifted backward, pulled by the weight of memory to the night that had started all of this. Not the night with Thomas Brennan. That was its own separate shame, its own complicated tangle of foolish hope and broken promises. No, the night that mattered, the one that had truly sealed her fate, was the one 4 weeks ago when everything had finally come crashing down. The evening had started ordinarily enough. Grace had been helping Mrs. Patterson with laundry, as she did most Tuesdays, earning a few coins that she saved in a small tin box under her bed. The work had been harder than usual, her body already beginning to change in small ways, fatigue setting in faster, nausea lurking at her, the edges of her awareness. But she'd push through because she needed the money, needed to start building something, anything that might help her once the pregnancy became impossible to hide. She'd return to the parsonage just after sunset, her arms aching from wringing wet sheets, her back sore from bending over the washboards. The house had been dark, except for the lamp burning in her father's study, warm light spilling out from under the closed door. Grace had paused in the hallway, debating whether to announce her return or simply slip upstairs to her room. The decision had been made for her when the study door opened. Reverend Josiah Holloway had stood framed in the doorway, backlit so that his expression was initially hidden in shadow, but Grace had felt it anyway, the weight of his gaze, heavy with something she couldn't quite name. "Come in here, Grace." Not a request, a command delivered in the same tone he used when calling sinners to repentance from the pulpit. Grace's stomach had dropped, but she'd stepped forward, entering the study with legs that suddenly felt unreliable beneath her. The room had smelled of leather and old paper, familiar scents that usually brought comfort. Her father's desk dominated the space, neat and organized, everything in its proper place. On the wall behind it hung a simple wooden cross, and beside that, a portrait of her mother painted the year before she died. Grace's eyes had gone to that portrait instinctively, seeking some kind of reassurance, but her mother's painted face offered nothing. Her father had closed the door with careful precision, then moved to stand behind his desk. He hadn't sat down, hadn't invited Grace to sit either. The formality of it had sent warning signals racing through her mind. "Mrs. Patterson came to see me this afternoon," he'd begun, his voice unnervingly calm. "She expressed some concerns." Grace's heart had hammered against her ribs. Mrs. Patterson, who'd noticed Grace's morning sickness, who'd seen her fatigue, who'd asked questions Grace had deflected with increasingly desperate lies. "She seems to think you might be certain condition." Her father's pause before that last word had been deliberate, waited. "I assured her she must be mistaken, that my daughter would never bring such disgrace upon herself or this family." The silence that followed had been suffocating. Grace had stood there, frozen, her mind frantically searching for the right words, the right explanation, anything that might soften what was coming. But her father's eyes, those eyes that had always seemed so righteous, so certain, had already condemned her. "Tell me she's wrong, Grace." Not a question, a demand. "Tell me you haven't been sneaking around like a common—" He'd stopped himself, jaw tightening. "Tell me you haven't betrayed everything I've taught you, everything your mother would have wanted for you." Grace had opened her mouth, but no sound came out. The truth sat, lodged in her throat like a stone, impossible to swallow, impossible to speak. Her father's face had hardened further. "How long?" "Papa, How long?" 4 months. The words had come out barely above a whisper. "Maybe closer to 5. The change in his expression had been subtle but devastating. Something had shifted behind his eyes, some fundamental connection severing. Grace had actually felt it, like a physical snap, the moment her father stopped seeing her as his daughter and started seeing her as something else. A problem, a liability, a sin made flesh. "Who?" The single word had been sharp as a blade. Thomas Brennan. No point in lying now. Her father's lip had curled slightly. The Brennan boy, of course. He'd moved then, pacing to the window that overlooked the small churchyard. His hands had clasped behind his back, rigid and controlled. His family left town 2 weeks ago. Moved to Kansas, they said. I suppose now I understand why. Grace had felt tears burning behind her eyes, but refused to let them fall. He didn't know. I told him, but then they just... Spare me. Her father had turned back to face her, and the coldness in his voice had been worse than any shouting. I don't care about the sordid details of your indiscretion. What I care about is that my daughter, the daughter of a man of God, has made herself into exactly the kind of woman I preach against every Sunday. I made a mistake. A mistake? His voice had risen slightly, the first crack in his controlled facade. A mistake is forgetting to latch the gate or burning the evening meal. This is not a mistake, Grace. This is a deliberate choice, a willful act of sin. You gave yourself to that boy outside the bonds of marriage, and now you're carrying the evidence of your shame. The words had landed like physical blows. Grace had wrapped her arms around herself, instinctively protective of the barely visible swell of her stomach. What do you want me to do? She'd whispered. Her father had laughed, but there had been no humor in it. What do I want? I want to turn back time. I want my daughter to have the moral strength to resist temptation. I want to be standing here having this conversation. He'd shaken his head. But none of that is possible now, is it? There are places, Grace had said desperately. Homes for girls, like I could go somewhere, have the baby, give it up for adoption. No one here has to know. I could come back and everything could go back to normal. Her father's eyebrow had risen. You think this is something we can simply sweep under the rug and pretend never happened? Mrs. Patterson knows. And if she knows, how long before others start to suspect? How long before the whispers start? Before people begin looking at me differently, wondering what kind of household I've been running? What kind of father I am? Understanding had dawned cold and terrible. This isn't about me at all, is it? It's about you. About your reputation. Don't you dare. Her father's voice had dropped to something dangerous. I have built my entire life around serving God, around being a moral example to this community. I have sacrificed. I have dedicated myself to righteousness. And now you would have me stand before my congregation, knowing what you've done, knowing that under my own roof. He'd broken off, breathing hard. Grace had felt something crumbling inside her chest, something that might have been hope or faith, or simply the last remnants of childish trust. What are you saying? Her father had straightened, and when he spoke again, his voice had regained its terrible calm. I'm saying that you can't stay here. I'm saying that I have a duty to this church, to this community, that supersedes my duty to a daughter who has proven herself unworthy of the name. The room had seemed to tilt. You're throwing me out. I'm removing a corrupting influence from my household and my ministry. The distinction had clearly mattered to him, even if the result was identical. I will not allow your sin to taint everything I've worked for. I'm 15 years old. Grace's voice had risen, cracking. I'm your daughter. I have nowhere to go, no money, no... You should have thought of that before you spread your legs for the Brennan boy. The crudeness of it, coming from her father's mouth, had been more shocking than a slap. Grace had actually recoiled, taking a step backward. Her father had seemed to realize he'd gone too far, or at least that he'd lost his carefully maintained composure. He'd cleared his throat, adjusting his collar. You'll leave tomorrow morning. I'll give you some food for the journey, and what little money I can spare. Where you go after that is your concern, not mine. Tomorrow? Grace had felt panic rising, threatening to choke her. But I can't. Tomorrow, her father had repeated firmly. Pack what you can carry. Be gone by sunrise. I don't want to see you, and I don't want the congregation to witness your departure and start asking questions. Please, the word had torn from her throat. Please, Papa, don't do this. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I'll do anything. The decision is made. Her father had returned to his desk, sitting down and pulling a ledger toward him, as if the conversation was already over. Close the door on your way out. Grace had stood there, frozen, waiting for him to look up, to meet her eyes one more time, to show even the smallest flicker of regret or hesitation. But he'd simply continued writing, his pen scratching across the page with steady, in different strokes. She'd backed toward the door, her vision swimming with tears she refused to shed in front of him. Her hand had found the doorknob, turned it, and still her father hadn't looked up. "Papa?" One last, desperate attempt. The pen had paused for just a moment. Then it resumed its scratching, and her father's voice came flat and final. "You stopped being my daughter the moment you chose sin over righteousness. Now get out of my sight." Grace had fled then, stumbling up the stairs to her small room, pressing her hand against her mouth to muffle the sobs that finally broke free. She'd packed through the night, trying to decide what mattered, what she could carry, what would help her survive whatever came next. Every item had felt like a choice between impossible options: the warm shawl or the spare dress, the book of poetry her mother had given her, or the practical sewing kit, sentiment or survival. By dawn, she'd had one small bundle. Her father had been waiting by the back door, not in the main hallway where someone might see. He'd handed her a cloth sack containing some bread, dried meat, and a handful of coins. $15, probably worth about 2 weeks of careful living, maybe less. Generous by some standards, insulting by others. Grace had taken it without a word. What was there left to say? Her father had opened the door, early morning light spilling in. "The Brennan family has connections in Kansas. If you're smart, you'll head that direction. Perhaps Thomas's people will take some responsibility." It was the closest thing to advice or concern he'd offered, and even that had been wrapped in the implication that this was her problem to solve, not his. Grace had stepped out into the cool dawn air. Behind her, the door had closed with a soft click. She'd stood there for a moment, staring at the wooden panels, half expecting them to open again, half hoping her father would call her back, would tell her this had all been a test of her character, a harsh lesson, but not an actual abandonment. The door had remained closed. Grace had heard the bolt slide into place from inside, a sound that had reverberated through her entire body. Final, irrevocable. The message is clear. Do not return. She'd walked away from the parsonage as the sun rose, her bundle clutched against her chest, her steps carrying her toward the edge of town. A few early risers had seen her. Mr. Chen opening his general store, old Mrs. Blackwell sweeping her porch, but no one had stopped her. No one had asked where she was going. Maybe they knew. Maybe they'd already heard the whispers, already understood what her departure meant. By the time San Miguel had disappeared behind her, swallowed by distance and the rising heat of the day, Grace had made herself a promise. She would survive this. She would find a way, for herself and for the baby who deserved better than a mother who gave up. But 3 days later, stumbling down that hill toward the creek, that promise had felt increasingly hollow. Survival required more than determination. It required luck and resources and help from sources she couldn't predict or control. A hand on her elbow pulled Grace from the memory. She blinked, disoriented, and realized she'd been walking automatically, following the stranger through the darkness, while her mind wandered through the past. They stood now before a small cabin, rough-hewn logs chinked with mud, a stone chimney rising from one end. Light glowed softly through one window, a lamp left burning inside. The man pushed open the door and gestured for her to enter. Grace hesitated on the threshold. Years of warnings about strange men and vulnerable girls warring with her desperate need for shelter. Then she thought of her father's closed door, of all the people who should have helped but didn't, and she stepped inside. The cabin was simple but clean: a stone fireplace, a rough table with 2 chairs, shelves holding supplies and basic cooking equipment. 2 doors led off from the main room. Bedrooms, Grace assumed. The man moved to the fireplace and began building up the fire from the embers still glowing there. "Food's in that cupboard," he said, nodding toward a cabinet near the table. "Help yourself to whatever you need. Bedroom on the left is yours while you're here. I'll be in the one on the right. Door's got a bolt on the inside if you want it." The casual mention of the bolt, acknowledging her fear, giving her control, did more to ease Grace's tension than any reassurance could have. She watched as he coaxed the fire to life, then stood and wiped his hands on his pants. "Name's Daniel," he said. "Daniel Bishop. Figured you might want to know that." Grace swallowed. Grace Holloway." Daniel nodded. "Get some food in you, Grace Holloway, then sleep. Morning's early enough to figure out what comes next." He moved toward the bedroom on the right, then paused at the door. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, not looking at her, "whatever you're running from, whatever you did or didn't do, you didn't deserve to be left to die on a road in the middle of nowhere." Before Grace could respond, He disappeared into his room, closing the door softly behind him. Grace stood alone in the main room, the fire crackling gently, the smell of wood smoke and something like safety filling her senses. She pressed both hands against her stomach, feeling the small swell there, the life that had cost her everything. "We're going to be okay," she whispered to the baby. And for the first time in weeks, she almost believed it. Grace woke to pain, not the dull ache she'd grown accustomed to over the past weeks, but something sharp and immediate, radiating from deep in her abdomen. She gasped, her eyes flying open to unfamiliar darkness, her mind scrambling to remember where she was. The cabin, Daniel Bishop's cabin. She'd fallen asleep in the small bedroom, still wearing her torn dress, too exhausted to do more than collapse onto the narrow bed. Another cramp seized her, stronger this time, and Grace curled onto her side, pressing both hands against her stomach. Fear flooded through her, cold and visceral. This wasn't normal. This wasn't the occasional discomfort she'd experienced before. This was something wrong, something dangerous. She tried to breathe through it, tried to remember what little she knew about pregnancy and its complications. Her mother had lost 2 babies before Grace was born, both early in the pregnancies. Grace remembered hushed conversations, her mother's pale face, the midwife coming and going with grim expressions. She remembered the word her parents had used, spoken in whispers they thought she couldn't hear. Miscarriage. No. Grace pressed her hands harder against her belly, as if she could hold everything together through sheer will. Not now. Not after everything. The baby was all she had left, the only thing that made sense of the past months, the only reason to keep fighting when everything else had fallen apart. The cramping eased slightly, and Grace forced herself to sit up. The room spun for a moment before settling. Moonlight filtered through the small window, casting everything in shades of silver and shadow. She needed water, needed to move, needed to do something besides lie here imagining the worst. She stood carefully, testing her balance. The floor was cold beneath her bare feet. She'd removed her boots before sleeping, some ingrained habit of propriety asserting itself even in crisis. Grace made her way to the door, easing it open as quietly as possible. No need to wake Daniel Bishop, no need to burden a stranger with problems he couldn't solve. The main room was dark, except for the dying fire in the hearth, embers glowing faintly. Grace moved toward the water bucket she'd seen earlier, near the cupboard. She'd just reached for the ladle when another cramp hit, this one strong enough to double her over. The ladle clattered against the bucket's edge, the sound impossibly loud in the quiet cabin. Grace gripped the edge of the table, breathing hard, waiting for the pain to pass. When it finally did, she became aware of light, lamplight, coming from the other bedroom. A door opened. Daniel appeared, hastily dressed, lamp in hand. His eyes went immediately to Grace, taking in her hunched posture, her white-knuckled grip on the table, the way she was breathing shallow and fast. "How long?" His voice was calm, but Grace heard the urgency beneath it. Just started." Grace managed to straighten slightly. "It's probably nothing. I just needed water." Daniel set the lamp on the table and moved to the water bucket, filling a cup and pressing it into her hands. "Drink slow." Grace obeyed, grateful for something to focus on besides the fear clawing at her insides. Daniel watched her for a moment, then moved to build up the fire, adding wood until flames began to catch and grow. The increased light revealed details Grace hadn't noticed before, a lifetime's worth of living in this small space. Belongings worn but well-maintained, everything speaking of solitary existence stretched over years. "How far along are you?" Daniel asked, not looking at her, his attention apparently focused on the fire. Grace hesitated. She'd grown so used to hiding, to deflecting questions, that honesty felt dangerous even now. But what was the point of lying? He'd figure it out soon enough, if he hadn't already. 5 months? Maybe a bit more? Daniel nodded, still adjusting the logs. "You bleeding?" The bluntness of the question should have shocked her, but instead Grace felt a strange relief. No euphemisms, no dancing around the reality of the situation, just practical assessment of what mattered. "I don't think so. I haven't checked." "You should." Daniel straightened, finally turning to look at her. "If you're bleeding, that's one thing. If you're not, might just be your body adjusting. The fall you took today didn't help matters." Grace blinked. How did you? Your dress is torn and you're scraped up. Your gait was uneven when we walked here. Doesn't take much to figure out you took a tumble." He gestured toward the bedroom she'd been sleeping in. "Go check. I'll heat some water, make tea. Chamomile helps with cramping sometimes." Grace wanted to argue, wanted to insist she was fine, but another wave of pain was building and she didn't have the strength for pride. She made her way back to the bedroom, closing the door behind her. With trembling hands, she conducted the examination she'd been dreading. No blood. The relief that flooded through her was so intense it made her dizzy. No blood meant the baby was likely still safe, still holding on despite everything Grace had put them both through. She stood there for a moment, one hand pressed against the rough wood of the door, letting herself simply breathe. When she emerged, Daniel had the kettle hanging over the fire and was pulling dried herbs from a shelf. He glanced at her, read the answer in her expression, and gave a single nod. "Good. Sit down before you fall down." Grace sank into one of the chairs at the table, her legs suddenly unreliable. Daniel worked in silence, preparing the tea with movements that spoke of long practice. When it was ready, he set a steaming cup in front of her. "Drink it all. Then you're going back to bed and staying there until morning at least." "I can't just—" "You can and you will." Daniel's voice remained calm but carried an edge of authority that reminded Grace oddly of her father, though without the coldness. "That baby needs you to rest, needs you to stop pushing yourself past endurance. You've been walking for days with no food, no water, no shelter. Your body's trying to tell you something. You should listen." Grace wrapped her hands around the cup, letting the warmth seep into her skin. The tea smelled earthy, faintly bitter, not unpleasant. She took a careful sip. "Why are you helping me?" The question emerged before she could stop it. "You don't know me. You don't know what I've done, or why I'm out here alone. For all you know, I could be what? A 15-year-old girl in trouble?" Daniel pulled out the other chair and sat across from her, his weathered hands folded on the table. "I can see what you are, Grace Holloway. Doesn't take a genius to figure out your situation, or why you might be running." Shame burned hot in Grace's chest. Of course he'd figured it out. Of course he knew. Everyone always knew, could always see the evidence of her failure written across her body and her circumstances. "I'm not asking for charity," she said quietly. "I can work. Once I'm better, I can help around here, earn my keep until—" "Until what? Until you have the baby? Then what?" The question hung in the air between them, impossible to answer because Grace had no answer. She'd been so focused on surviving each day that she hadn't let herself think beyond the immediate crisis. But eventually the baby would come, and then what? How did a 16-year-old girl with no family, no money, no prospects raise a child in a place as unforgiving as West Texas? "I don't know," Grace whispered. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, studying her with those storm-gray eyes that seemed to see too much. Then he leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "Finish your tea. Get some rest. Morning's soon enough to worry about tomorrow." Grace wanted to push, wanted to know what he was thinking, what he intended, whether his help came with conditions she couldn't meet. But exhaustion was pulling at her again, the tea warming her from the inside, the chamomile beginning to ease the cramping. She drained the cup and stood carefully. "Thank you," she managed. "For the tea, for everything." Daniel nodded toward the bedroom. "Go on. And Grace, if the cramping gets worse, if anything changes, you wake me. Understood?" Grace nodded and returned to the small bedroom, closing the door behind her. She lay down on the narrow bed, pulling the thin blanket over herself, and closed her eyes. Sleep came easier this time, the fear receding now that the immediate crisis had passed. But rest didn't last long. Grace woke again perhaps an hour later, though it was impossible to be certain. This time it wasn't cramping that pulled her from sleep, but sound. Voices outside, multiple voices, rough and loud. Her eyes snapped open, heart immediately racing. Through the small window she could see torchlight flickering orange against the darkness. She sat up slowly, straining to hear. The voices were clearer now, close to the cabin. "Saw smoke earlier. Someone's in there. Could be Bishop, could be someone else. Either way worth checking. Place like this, man living alone, probably has Supplies worth taking. Grace's blood ran cold. Bandits, raiders, men looking for easy targets in the scattered homesteads that dotted the frontier. She'd heard stories about them in San Miguel, warnings from travelers about the lawless territories where violence came easy and justice came slow or not at all. She heard movement in the main room. Daniel, clearly awake and aware of the danger. Grace eased off the bed, her legs still unsteady, and moved to the door. She opened it a crack, peering out. Daniel stood near the fireplace, his rifle in hand, his posture alert but controlled. He glanced at Grace, his expression grim, and gestured sharply toward the back corner of the room. Hide! Before Grace could move, someone hammered on the door. Open up! We know you're in there! Daniel didn't respond immediately. Instead, he moved to the window, keeping to the side, and looked out. Grace counted at least 3 distinct voices outside, maybe more, too many for one man to fight, even one as calm and capable as Daniel Bishop appeared to be. Another hammering on the door, harder this time. We don't want trouble, friend. Just need supplies, water, food. You share what you got, we'll be on our way. Peaceful like. Daniel's jaw tightened. Grace knew that tone, recognized the false friendliness masking threat. These men hadn't come to ask politely. They'd come to take, and whether they did it with Daniel's cooperation or over his dead body seemed almost incidental to them. I got nothing worth taking, Daniel called out, his voice steady. And I'm armed. Best you move along. Laughter outside, harsh and mocking. Hear that, boys? He's armed. 1 rifle against 4 of us. I like those odds. 4. Grace felt her stomach drop. Daniel couldn't fight 4 armed men. No one could, not without getting killed in the process. The hammering stopped. For a moment there was only silence, thick and terrible. Then Grace heard a different sound, footsteps circling the cabin, testing for weak points, looking for other ways in. Daniel heard it too. His grip tightened on the rifle. Grace, he said quietly, not looking at her. The bedroom. Push the bureau against the door. Stay there no matter what you hear. Understand? I can't just leave you to... You can and you will. His voice was hard now, brooking no argument. That baby you're carrying is worth more than whatever happens out here. Now move. Grace wanted to argue, wanted to find some way to help, but she knew he was right. In a fight, she'd be a liability, something for him to protect rather than an asset. And if these men got inside, if they found her... She retreated to the bedroom, closing the door behind her. The bureau he'd mentioned was a heavy wooden piece against one wall. Grace put her shoulder against it and pushed, her muscles screaming protest, but desperation gave her strength. The bureau scraped across the floor, loud in the small room, until it blocked the door. Then she stood there, breathing hard, listening to the sounds from outside. The window in her room was too small to climb through, too high to reach easily. She was trapped, her safety dependent entirely on Daniel Bishop's ability to defend this cabin against men who'd clearly decided violence was acceptable. A gunshot shattered the night. Grace's hands flew to her mouth, stifling a scream. More shots followed, the crack of rifles echoing. She heard shouting, cursing, the sound of something heavy hitting the cabin's outer wall. Then silence, terrible and complete. Grace pressed herself against the wall, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. Was Daniel alive? Dead? Had the raiders gotten inside? Were they searching the cabin right now, about to find her hiding place? Footsteps in the main room, heavy, purposeful. Grace looked around desperately for anything that might serve as a weapon. The lamp, she could throw it, maybe start a fire, create confusion. Her fingers closed around the glass base. The footsteps stopped outside the bedroom door. Someone tested the handle, found it blocked. Grace? Daniel's voice, rough but unmistakably alive. You all right in there? Relief flooded through her so intensely that her knees nearly buckled. Yes. Are they gone? Dead mostly. One ran off. Daniel paused. Going to need your help moving the bureau. Can't get in with it blocking the door. Grace set down the lamp and pushed the heavy furniture away from the door. When it was clear, She yanked the door open. Daniel stood there, his shirt torn, blood on his sleeve, his blood or someone else's. Grace couldn't tell. The rifle was still in his hand, barrel still warm from firing. "You're hurt," Grace said, reaching for his arm. Daniel glanced down, as if surprised. "Grazed. Nothing serious." He moved past her into the room, checking the window, making sure no one was trying to breach it. Satisfied, he returned his attention to Grace. "They're dead, 3 of them. The 4th took off running when he realized how this was going to end." "You killed 3 men?" Grace heard the shock in her own voice. "I did what I had to do to protect this place, to protect you." Daniel met her eyes directly. "They made their choice when they came here looking for trouble. I made mine when I pulled that trigger. No room for regret in decisions like that." Grace stared at him, trying to reconcile this calm, matter-of-fact violence with the man who'd made her chamomile tea and offered her shelter. But maybe they weren't contradictory. Maybe surviving out here required the ability to show kindness and dispense death with equal measure, depending on what circumstances demanded. "What do we do now?" she asked quietly. "Now I drag their bodies far enough from the cabin that scavengers won't be a problem. Come morning, I bury them properly. Say whatever words seem appropriate." Daniel moved toward the main room. "You stay inside. Keep that bureau against the door. The one who ran might come back with friends, might not. Either way, no point taking chances." He was halfway to the door when Grace's voice stopped him. "Why?" Daniel turned back. "Why what? Why protect me? Why risk your life for someone you just met? Someone who's brought nothing but trouble?" Daniel was quiet for a long moment, his expression unreadable in the lamplight. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that spoke of old pain, old loss. "Because I couldn't protect the people who mattered before. Because 3 years ago, I came home and found my wife and son dead. Killed by men, not much different from the ones lying outside right now. Because I've spent every day since then wishing I'd been there, wishing I'd had a chance to do something, anything, to change how that ended." He shifted the rifle to his other hand. "I can't bring them back, Grace. Can't undo what happened, but I can damn sure make certain it doesn't happen again. Not while I'm breathing, not while there's something I can do about it." Grace felt tears burning behind her eyes, but she blinked them back. "I'm sorry about your family." Daniel nodded once, accepting the sentiment without elaboration. Then he turned and walked out into the night, leaving Grace alone with the weight of what he'd just shared, what he'd just done, and the growing realization that Daniel Bishop's offer of shelter came with depths she was only beginning to understand. She moved to the main room, watching through the window as he dragged the first body into the darkness beyond the torchlight. The night had turned cold, stars sharp and bright overhead, indifferent to the violence that had unfolded beneath them. Grace wrapped her arms around herself, feeling the baby shift slightly inside her. They'd survived tonight. Daniel had made sure of that, had killed to ensure it. That knowledge should have frightened her, should have made her question the wisdom of staying here with a man capable of such violence. Instead, she felt safer than she had in months, because Daniel Bishop's violence wasn't random or cruel. It was purposeful, protective, deployed in defense of something he'd decided mattered. And somehow, impossibly, Grace and her unborn child had become part of what mattered to him. She watched him work until he disappeared into the darkness, then returned to the bedroom and pushed the bureau back against the door, not because she feared Daniel, but because she trusted him when he said the 4th raider might return. Sleep was impossible now, so Grace sat on the bed, one hand resting on her stomach, and waited for dawn. Outside, Daniel Bishop buried the dead and kept watch, a solitary figure standing between her and the darkness that seemed determined to swallow them both. But dawn would come, it always did, and with it, perhaps, a chance to finally understand what she'd stumbled into when she'd collapsed by that creek and Daniel Bishop had chosen to care. Morning came slowly, the sky shifting from black to deep blue to the pale gray of early dawn. Grace had not slept after the attack, had spent the hours sitting by the window watching for Daniel's return, listening for any sound that might signal more danger. When he finally appeared, emerging from the pre-dawn gloom with his rifle slung over one shoulder and dirt on his hands, she felt something tight in her chest, finally loosen. He didn't knock, simply opened the door and entered, moving immediately to the fireplace to coax the embers back to life. Grace watched him from the doorway of the bedroom, noting the way exhaustion had carved deeper lines around his eyes, the way his movements were slower than before, weighted with something beyond physical fatigue. "It's done," he said without looking at her. "They're buried," said what words I could remember. Grace stepped into the main room, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor. "You didn't have to bury them after what they tried to do." "They were still men," Daniel added, kindling to the growing flames, his voice matter-of-fact. "Still somebody's sons, maybe somebody's brothers. Burying them proper doesn't excuse what they did, but it doesn't diminish what we are either." The "we" settled into the space between them, casual but weighted with meaning. We, as if in one night of violence and survival, they'd become something more than stranger and refugee, something closer to allies or partners in the hard business of staying alive. Daniel stood, wiping his hands on his pants. "You should eat something, then sleep if you can manage it." "I'm not hungry," Grace said, though her stomach immediately contradicted her with a low growl. Daniel's mouth twitched in what might have been the ghost of a smile. "Your body says different. Sit down, I'll make breakfast." Grace wanted to argue, wanted to insist she could take care of herself, but the events of the night had stripped away what little energy she'd managed to rebuild. She sank into one of the chairs at the table and watched as Daniel moved through the small cabin with quiet efficiency. He didn't cook elaborate food, just cornmeal mush with a bit of salt pork and some dried apples reconstituted in hot water, but the smell of it made Grace's mouth water. And when he set a plate in front of her, she found herself eating with a hunger that surprised her. Real hunger, not the desperate clawing need of starvation, but the body's simple demand for fuel after too many days without it. Daniel ate standing, his back to the wall, positioned where he could see both the door and the window. Always watching, Grace realized. Always ready. She wondered if he'd been like this before his family died, or if hypervigilance was something he'd learned in the aftermath, a habit carved into him by loss and the fear of failing to protect what mattered again. They ate in silence, the only sounds the scrape of spoons against tin plates and the crackle of the fire. It should have been uncomfortable, this wordless meal with a man who'd killed her just hours ago. But instead, Grace found it oddly peaceful, a shared moment that required nothing from her, no performance or explanation or justification for her existence. When she'd eaten as much as she could manage, Daniel took her plate without comment and set it aside. Then he pulled out the other chair and sat across from her, his hands folded on the table in a gesture that was becoming familiar. "You need to stay in bed for at least 3 days," he said. "Give your body time to recover from the walking, the fall, the cramping last night. That baby needs you rested." Grace opened her mouth to protest, but Daniel held up one hand. "I know you're not used to being idle. I know you probably think you need to earn your keep, prove you're not a burden. But right now, the best thing you can do, the only thing that matters, is take care of yourself and that child." He paused. "Everything else can wait." The simple certainty in his voice made the argument feel futile. Grace nodded slowly. 3 days. 3 days minimum," Daniel corrected. "After that, we'll see how you're doing." He stood and moved to clear the dishes, but Grace caught his sleeve as he passed. He stopped, looking down at her with those storm-gray eyes that had seen too much death and somehow still held room for kindness. "Thank you," Grace said quietly, "for last night, for this, for not turning me away when you had every reason to." Daniel was quiet for a moment, studying her face as if trying to decide something. Then he gave a single nod. "Get some rest, Grace Holloway. Morning's already wasting, and you look like you're about to fall over where you sit." Grace returned to the small bedroom, and this time when she lay down, sleep came almost immediately, pulling her under into dreamless darkness where raiders didn't exist and fathers loved their daughters, and pregnant 15-year-old girls weren't cast out to die in the unforgiving heat of a Texas summer. The days that followed took on a rhythm Grace hadn't expected. She slept more than she'd thought possible, her body apparently determined to make up for weeks of inadequate rest. When she was awake, she remained in the bedroom as Daniel had instructed, though he'd She'd moved a chair near the window so she could at least look out at the landscape beyond. Daniel himself was a quiet presence, moving through the cabin with minimal conversation. He brought her meals 3 times a day. Simple fare, but always enough, always prepared with care. He checked on her periodically, asking brief questions about the cramping, about whether she was bleeding, about how she felt. Medical inquiries delivered in the same matter-of-fact tone he used for everything else, stripping away embarrassment through sheer practicality. Grace found herself studying him during these brief interactions, trying to understand this man who'd inserted himself between her and death with such decisive violence. He was older than she'd initially thought, probably mid-40s rather than late 30s, though the weathering of frontier life made precise age difficult to determine. His hands were scarred and calloused, speaking of decades of hard physical labor. When he thought she wasn't watching, his expression settled into something distant and sad, a man keeping company with ghosts. On the second day, Grace woke from an afternoon nap to find Daniel in the main room, working at something on the table. She rose carefully. The cramping had subsided significantly, her body finally responding to rest and regular food, and moved to the doorway. Daniel had a piece of leather spread before him, and he was stitching something with careful, precise movements, a needle and heavy thread, his large hands managing the delicate work with surprising dexterity. "What are you making?" Grace asked. Daniel glanced up, seemed to consider whether to answer, then gestured to her worn boots sitting nearby. "Your boots are falling apart. Won't last another week of walking. Thought I'd reinforce them. Replace what I can." Grace blinked, surprised. "You don't have to. They need fixing," Daniel said simply, as if that were enough explanation. "Might as well do it now, while you're resting anyway." Grace moved closer, watching him work. The stitching was neat, professional, each pull of the thread measured and even. "Where did you learn to do that?" "Necessity, mostly. Out here, you learn to fix what breaks or you go without." He paused in his work, examining the seam. "My father was a saddle maker back in Missouri. Some of it stuck, I suppose." It was the first personal detail he'd volunteered about his life before, the first glimpse into whoever Daniel Bishop had been before grief and isolation carved him into the man sitting before her. Grace wanted to ask more, wanted to understand the path that had led him to this lonely cabin in the middle of nowhere, but she sensed the fragility of the moment, how easily questions might close him back up. Instead, she simply said, "That's a useful skill." Daniel made a sound that might have been agreement and returned to his stitching. Grace settled into the other chair, content to watch in silence. There was something soothing about it, the repetitive motion of needle through leather, the way Daniel's face relaxed into concentration, the quiet companionship of shared space without the pressure of conversation. After a while, Daniel set the boot aside and reached for something else, a small piece of wood and a knife. Grace recognized it immediately as the beginning of a carving, though the shape was still too rough to identify what it might become. "What are you making?" she asked again. This time, Daniel's mouth twitched into something that might have been a smile. "You ask a lot of questions. You don't answer very many." "Fair enough." He turned the wood in his hands, considering it. "Haven't decided yet. Sometimes you just start cutting and see what wants to emerge." Grace watched as he made the first careful cuts, wood shavings falling to the table. His hands moved with the same precision they'd shown with the leather work, measuring each stroke before executing it. There was something almost meditative about it, a man communing with raw material, coaxing form from formlessness. "Did you make things for them?" The question escaped before Grace could stop it. "For your wife and son?" Daniel's hands stilled for just a moment, the knife hovering above the wood. Then he resumed cutting. His voice, when it came, was quiet but steady. "I did. Made Sarah a jewelry box for our first anniversary. Made little toy horses for Caleb, a whole herd of them. He'd spend hours setting them up, inventing stories about where they were going, what adventures they were having." The past tense hung heavy in the air. Grace felt the weight of it, the finality of lives reduced to memory and grief. "How old was he?" she asked softly. 7, just turned 7 the month before." Daniel trailed off, his jaw tightening. He set down the knife and the wood, his hands folding together on the table. He was learning to read. Sarah was teaching him from the Bible, same way she learned. He'd sound out the words so careful, so proud when he got through a whole verse without help. Grace felt tears burning behind her eyes, not just for Daniel's loss, but for everything it represented, the fragility of life, the way violence could shatter a world in an instant, the cruel randomness of who survived and who didn't. "I'm sorry," she whispered, inadequate words for inadequate comfort. Daniel nodded, accepting the sentiment. Then he picked up the wood and knife again, his hands resuming their work as if the brief vulnerability had never happened. But Grace had seen it, had witnessed the way pain lived just beneath the surface of this quiet, controlled man, always there, always waiting for an unguarded moment to surface. They sat in silence for a long time after that, Daniel carving and Grace watching the firelight dance across the walls. The afternoon faded into evening, and still they remained, two people bound by circumstance and survival, learning to exist in each other's orbit without collision or demand. On the third day, Grace felt strong enough to dress properly and spend more time in the main room. The cramping had ceased entirely, and the bone-deep exhaustion that had plagued her was finally beginning to lift. She emerged from the bedroom to find Daniel checking supplies in the cupboard, his expression thoughtful. "Running low on cornmeal," he said without preamble, "and the salt pork won't last more than another week. Going to need to make a trip into Sweetwater, pick up supplies." Sweetwater. Grace felt something cold settle in her stomach. A town meant people, meant questions, meant the risk of gossip spreading about Daniel Bishop harboring a pregnant girl at his homestead. She'd seen how quickly reputations could be destroyed in small frontier communities, how association with scandal could poison a man's standing. "I can stay here," she offered quickly. "You don't need to. I mean, people might talk if they know I'm—" "People always talk," Daniel cut her off, "especially in a place like Sweetwater where there's not much else to occupy their minds." He closed the cupboard and turned to face her. "But I'm not in the habit of making decisions based on what small-minded folks might whisper over their dinner tables." Grace wrapped her arms around herself. "I don't want to make trouble for you. You've already done so much, and if people think what? That I gave shelter to someone who needed it?" Daniel's voice was firm but not unkind. "Let them think. Their opinions don't keep me warm at night or put food on this table." He moved to the fireplace, stirring the embers. "Besides, you'll need proper supplies soon. Fabric for making baby clothes, extra blankets, things I don't have on hand. Might as well face down the gossips now. Let them get their gawking done early." The casual assumption that she'd still be here when the baby came, that he was planning for a future that included her, made Grace's throat tight. She'd grown so accustomed to temporary arrangements, to always being on the verge of departure, that the idea of permanence felt foreign and frightening. "When will you go?" she asked. "Tomorrow, probably. It's a half-day's ride, so I'll leave early. Be back by nightfall." Daniel glanced at her. "You'll be all right here alone?" Grace thought about the raiders, about the fourth man who'd escaped into the darkness. But she also thought about the bolt on the bedroom door, about Daniel's rifle that he would undoubtedly leave within reach, about the 3 days of rest that had restored some of her strength. "I'll be fine," she said, with more confidence than she felt. Daniel nodded, apparently satisfied. Then he surprised her by crossing to the shelf near the fireplace and removing a small pistol, which he brought to her. "You know how to use one of these?" Grace shook her head. Growing up in a preacher's house, weapons had been forbidden. Her father had believed in moral authority and God's protection, both of which had proven insufficient in the end. "Then I'll teach you." Daniel checked that the pistol was unloaded, then gestured for Grace to follow him outside. The afternoon was warm but not oppressively hot, a breeze carrying the scent of sage and dust. Daniel led her a short distance from the cabin to where several old bottles and tin cans had been set up on a fallen log, a makeshift shooting range, Grace realized. Daniel handed her the pistol, showing her how to hold it properly, how to sight along the barrel, how to squeeze the trigger rather than jerking it. His instructions were clear and patient, delivered without condescension or impatience when she fumbled or asked him to repeat something. "Guns are tools," he said as he loaded the pistol with careful precision. "Dangerous tools, but tools nonetheless. Respect them, understand them, but don't fear them. Fear makes you hesitate, and hesitation can get you killed." He stood behind her, adjusting her stance, guiding her arms into position. Grace was acutely aware of his proximity, of the warmth of his body close to hers, of the scent of wood smoke and leather that clung to him. It wasn't attraction, not exactly, but something else, a heightened awareness of his presence that made her pulse quicken. "When you're ready," Daniel said quietly, "aim for that bottle on the left." Grace focused on the bottle, on her breathing, on the weight of the pistol in her hands. Then she squeezed the trigger. The recoil surprised her, the pistol kicking back harder than expected. Her shot went wide, kicking up dirt several feet from the target. But Daniel simply nodded. "Good. You didn't close your eyes, didn't flinch away from the sound. That's more than most people manage their first time." He reloaded the pistol. "Try again." They spent the better part of an hour practicing, Grace gradually improving until she could at least hit the log even if the bottles remained stubbornly intact. By the time Daniel called a halt, her arms were tired and her ears were ringing, but she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Capable, not helpless, not dependent entirely on the kindness or cruelty of others, but able to defend herself if necessary. Daniel took the pistol back, checked it thoroughly, then handed it to her again. "Keep this in the bedroom while I'm gone tomorrow. If anyone comes to the door who isn't me, you don't open it. If they try to force their way in, you use that." He met her eyes directly. "Aim for center mass. Don't try for fancy shots. Just point and shoot until the threat stops." Grace swallowed hard, the weight of the pistol suddenly feeling much heavier. "I don't know if I could actually. You'd be surprised what you can do when survival demands it." Daniel's voice was gentle but firm. "I'm not saying you'll have to. Odds are you'll spend the whole day bored and lonely. But better to have the ability and not need it than to need it and not have it." Grace nodded, tucking the pistol carefully into her dress pocket. They walked back to the cabin together, the afternoon sun warm on their shoulders. And for just a moment, Grace let herself imagine that this was normal, that she belonged here, that the future might hold something besides fear and uncertainty. That evening, Daniel prepared a larger meal than usual. Beans cooked with salt pork, cornbread, even some canned peaches he'd been saving. They ate together at the table, and for the first time since Grace arrived, conversation came more easily. Small things, inconsequential things. Daniel telling her about the family of foxes that denned near the creek each spring. Grace sharing memories of her mother, carefully edited stories that skipped over the pain of loss and focused on warmer moments. Neither of them mentioned what tomorrow would bring. Daniel's departure, Grace's solitude, the town of Sweetwater, and whatever judgments it might render. Instead, they simply existed in the moment. Two damaged people finding unexpected comfort in shared space and simple food. After dinner, Grace helped wash the dishes despite Daniel's protests. It felt good to be useful, to contribute something however small to the functioning of this household. When everything was cleaned and put away, she found herself lingering in the main room, reluctant to retreat to the bedroom and end the evening. Daniel seemed to sense her hesitation. He gestured to the chair by the fire. "You can sit out here if you want. I'll be working on those boots a bit longer." Grace settled into the chair, watching as Daniel resumed his leatherwork. The fire crackled softly, casting dancing shadows across the cabin walls. Outside, night birds called to each other, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled at the emerging stars. This was peace, Grace realized, this quiet moment of domestic contentment, of feeling safe and warm and not alone. It was something she'd taken for granted growing up, something she'd lost when her father closed his door, something she'd thought might be forever out of reach. And yet here it was, found in the most unlikely place, with the most unlikely person, a reclusive widower and a pregnant girl, brought together by circumstance and held together by something neither of them had quite named yet, but both were beginning to understand. Grace let her eyes close, listening to the soft sounds of Daniel's work, the fire, the night. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. But tonight, for the first time in longer than she could remember, Grace Holloway felt something dangerously close to hope. Daniel left before dawn, as promised. Grace woke to the sound of his horse being saddled outside, the creak of leather and the soft murmur of his voice calming the animal. She rose and moved to the window, watching as he secured supplies to the saddle. Empty sacks that would return filled with provisions, a canteen, his rifle in its scabbard. He glanced toward the cabin once before mounting, and though Grace stood back from the window where the dim interior would hide her. She had the distinct impression he knew she was watching. Then he turned the horse toward the rising sun and rode out, his figure growing smaller against the vast landscape until distance swallowed him entirely. Grace stood there for a long time after he'd disappeared, suddenly aware of how quiet the cabin had become. The fire still burned low in the hearth, and the familiar smells of wood smoke and coffee lingered. But without Daniel's presence, the space felt larger, emptier, more vulnerable than it had just moments before. She made herself move, made herself go through the motions Daniel had demonstrated over the past days. Build up the fire, make coffee, eat something even though her stomach was tight with an anxiety she couldn't quite name. Check the pistol, still loaded, still ready, and keep it within reach. The morning stretched long and strange. Grace tried to occupy herself with small tasks, sweeping the already clean floor, organizing supplies that were already organized, anything to keep her hands busy and her mind from wandering toward worry. What if Daniel encountered trouble in Sweetwater? What if the raiders' fourth companion had circled back? What if some accident on the trail left her here alone with no way of knowing what had happened? By midday, the cabin felt like a cage. Grace stood at the doorway, looking out at the landscape beyond. The land rolled gentle here, punctuated by scrub brush and the occasional cottonwood marking underground water. In the distance, mountains rose purple and hazy against the horizon, beautiful in its own harsh way, but unforgiving to anyone who didn't respect its dangers. Grace thought about her father, wondered if he ever thought about her, if he ever regretted his decision. Probably not. Reverend Josiah Holloway was not a man given to doubt or second-guessing. He'd made his choice based on what he believed was righteous, and nothing, not his daughter's welfare, not her desperate circumstances, not even the grandchild growing inside her, would make him question that certainty. The bitterness of that realization sat heavy in Grace's chest. She'd spent weeks hoping that maybe he'd come looking for her, that maybe guilt or love would overcome his anger and pride. But standing here in Daniel's doorway, looking out at the endless Texas frontier, Grace finally let that hope die. Her father had closed his door, bolted it shut, and nothing would make him open it again. Strange that the acceptance hurt less than she'd expected. Maybe because she'd found something here she hadn't anticipated. Not a replacement for family exactly, but proof that care could come from unexpected sources, that strangers might show more compassion than blood. A movement in the distance caught her attention. Grace tensed, her hand moving instinctively toward the pistol in her pocket. But it was only a deer, picking its way carefully through the brush, stopping occasionally to test the air. Grace watched it for a long moment, envying its simple existence. The way it moved through the world concerned only with immediate needs, food, water, avoiding predators. The deer caught her scent on the wind and bounded away, disappearing into a draw between two low hills. Grace stepped back inside, closing the door against the heat that was building as the sun climbed higher. She'd give anything for something to do, some task that would make the hours pass faster. Her eyes fell on Daniel's unfinished carving, still sitting on the table where he'd left it. The wood had begun to take shape over the past days, revealing what looked like it might become a bird, though the details were still rough. Grace picked it up carefully, running her fingers over the smooth surfaces where Daniel's knife had already worked, the rough patches still waiting for attention. She shouldn't touch it. It wasn't hers, and Daniel hadn't offered to let her work on it, but her hands itched for something to do, and the carving seemed to call for completion. Grace found Daniel's knife, sharp and well-maintained, and settled into his chair at the table. She started with the easiest cuts, smoothing rough edges, cleaning up lines Daniel had already established. The work was meditative, requiring just enough concentration to quiet her anxious thoughts without demanding expertise she didn't possess. Wood shavings accumulated on the table, and gradually the bird emerged more clearly. A sparrow, Grace thought, though she wasn't certain. Hours passed without her noticing. The light through the window shifted as the sun moved across the sky, and Grace's hands grew more confident with the knife, more certain of what the wood wanted to become. She was so absorbed in the work that she didn't hear the horse approaching until it was nearly at the door. Grace's head snapped up. her heart hammering. She set down the carving and grabbed the pistol, moving quickly to the window. Relief flooded through her when she recognized Daniel's familiar silhouette, his horse laden with supplies. She opened the door as he dismounted, and something in his expression shifted when he saw her. Relief, maybe, or satisfaction that she was safe and whole. He nodded once, that economical gesture she'd come to recognize as his version of demonstrative emotion, then began unloading supplies. "Any trouble?" Grace asked, tucking the pistol back into her pocket. "None worth mentioning." Daniel handed her a sack of cornmeal, then reached for another. Town was quiet. Got what we needed. Grace carried the cornmeal inside, noting the sheer quantity of supplies Daniel had brought back. Not just enough for one person to get through a few weeks, but provisions for 2 people for considerably longer. Flour, sugar, salt, dried beans, coffee, cornmeal, a bolt of plain cotton fabric, needles and thread, a tin of kerosene for the lamps. "You bought enough for an army," Grace observed, trying to keep her voice light even as her throat tightened with understanding. He was planning for her to stay, planning for the baby, making concrete preparations for a future that included them both. Daniel set down the last of the supplies and glanced at her. "Winter comes hard out here. Better to stock up now while the weather holds." It was a practical explanation and also an evasion. They both knew it. Grace decided not to push, not to force him to articulate something he clearly preferred to demonstrate through action rather than words. "Did anyone ask questions?" she asked instead. "About the extra supplies?" "Marvin Cooper at the general store made some comments. I ignored them." Daniel moved to put the flour away. "People can think what they want. Doesn't change anything." Grace helped organize the supplies, and as they worked side by side in the small space, she became aware of the carving still sitting on the table, wood shavings scattered around it. Daniel noticed it too. He picked up the bird, turning it in his hands, examining the work she'd done. Grace braced herself for criticism or irritation at her presumption in touching his work. Instead, Daniel's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "You did good work here," he said quietly. "Got a steady hand. I'm sorry if I overstepped. I just needed something to do, and it was sitting there, and you didn't overstep." Daniel set the bird back on the table. "Truth is, I'd been stuck on how to finish it. You saw something I didn't." He paused. "Keep working on it if you want. Might as well see it through to completion." The casual gift of that permission, the implicit trust it represented, made Grace's chest tight. She nodded, not trusting her voice. They finished putting away supplies in companionable silence. Then Daniel made a simple dinner of beans and cornbread. As they ate, he shared small details from his trip to Sweetwater. Nothing dramatic, just observations about people and places, the kind of mundane social information Grace had been starved for after weeks of isolation. "Mrs. Henderson had her baby," Daniel mentioned. "4th child, another girl. She looked tired but happy." Grace found herself hungry for these details, for proof that the world beyond this cabin still existed, still moved forward with births and deaths and the ordinary machinery of life. "What about the church? Is there still a circuit preacher? Comes through once a month? Next service is Sunday week." Daniel glanced at her. "You wanting to go?" "Did she?" Grace considered it. The thought of sitting in a church, surrounded by judgmental eyes and whispered speculation, made her stomach turn. But she also missed it. The hymns, the ritual, the sense of connection to something larger than herself. Her father had poisoned it for her, twisted faith into a weapon. But maybe here, far from San Miguel, worship could mean something different. "Maybe," she said carefully. "Would you go with me?" Daniel was quiet for a moment, his expression unreadable. "Haven't been to church since Sarah and Caleb died. Didn't see much point in praising a God who'd allow that kind of suffering." The honesty of it struck Grace hard. Her own faith had been shaken by her father's rejection, but she'd never quite articulated the fundamental question beneath it: how to reconcile belief in a loving God with the cruelty she'd experienced. Apparently Daniel had asked that question and come away with no satisfactory answer. "I understand that," Grace said softly. "But maybe going to church isn't about praising God for what happens. Maybe it's about finding other people who are trying to make sense of things too." Daniel looked at her for a long moment, something shifting in his expression. "Maybe," he allowed. "We'll see when the time comes." After dinner, they settled into what had become their evening routine. Daniel at the table working on various repair projects, Grace in the chair by the fire with the carving. But tonight felt different somehow, marked by Daniel's return and the unspoken acknowledgement that their arrangement had shifted from temporary shelter to something more permanent. Grace worked on the sparrow's wings, carefully defining individual feathers, trying to capture the sense of movement even in the stillness of wood. Daniel had moved on from boot repair to mending a shirt, his needle moving through fabric with the same patient precision he brought to everything. "My mother used to say you could tell a lot about a person by how they mended things," Grace said, breaking the comfortable silence. "Whether they took care with it or just patched it quick and careless." Daniel's needle paused mid-stitch. "What do you think she'd say about my mending?" Grace considered him. The careful, even stitches, the way he'd matched thread to fabric, the attention to making the repair nearly invisible. "She'd say, you're someone who takes pride in doing things right, someone who values things lasting. Your mother sounds like she was wise." She was. Grace's throat tightened. "She died when I was 13. Fever. It came on fast, and the doctor couldn't do anything to stop it." She paused. "My father changed after that, got harder, more rigid, like he couldn't afford to be soft anymore, or he'd break entirely. Grief does strange things to people," Daniel said quietly. "Makes some folks reach out for connection, makes others pull back and wall themselves off. Neither way is wrong, exactly, just different ways of surviving." Grace thought about her father, wondered if Daniel was right, if the coldness she'd interpreted as cruelty might have been just another form of self-protection. But even if that were true, it didn't excuse what he'd done. Understanding why someone hurt you didn't obligate you to forgive them. "Did you wall yourself off?" Grace asked. "After your family died?" Daniel set down his mending, his hands folding together. "I did. Came out here, built this cabin as far from other people as I could manage. Told myself I was better off alone, that caring about anyone just gave the world more ways to hurt you." "What changed?" Daniel's eyes met hers across the space between them, grey and direct and holding something Grace couldn't quite name. "Nothing changed. Then you showed up half dead by that creek, and I realized walls don't protect you from feeling things. They just make you isolated while you feel them." The weight of that admission hung in the air between them. Grace set down the carving, her hands suddenly unsteady. "Daniel, don't," he said gently. "Don't say anything you're not ready to say. I'm not asking for declarations or promises. I'm just telling you that you being here matters. That's all." Grace nodded, her throat too tight for words. The fire crackled softly, and outside the wind had picked up, carrying the scent of coming rain. Daniel returned to his mending, giving her space to process what he'd shared. And Grace picked up the sparrow again, her hands working automatically while her mind turned over his words. That night, lying in the small bedroom, Grace found sleep elusive. She could hear Daniel moving around in the main room, his quiet footsteps, the sound of him banking the fire for the night. Through the thin walls, she heard him enter his own bedroom, heard the creak of his bed as he settled into it. They were separated by walls and propriety, and the vast differences in their circumstances, and yet Grace had never felt closer to another human being. The realization terrified her because she knew how quickly closeness could turn to loss, how easily care could be weaponized or withdrawn. But it also filled her with something that felt dangerously like hope. The days that followed took on a new quality. Daniel no longer treated Grace like a patient who needed constant rest, but rather as someone capable of contributing to the household. He taught her how to manage the garden he'd planted behind the cabin, vegetables struggling against the harsh Texas sun, but producing enough to supplement their diet. Showed her how to preserve food for the coming winter, the techniques for drying meat and storing root vegetables. Grace proved quick to learn, absorbing information with the desperate intensity of someone who understood that survival depended on knowledge. She'd spent her whole life learning to be a preacher's daughter, how to smile politely, how to arrange flowers, how to quote scripture. Now she was learning to be something else entirely, self-sufficient, capable, strong in ways she'd never imagined needing to be. One afternoon, Daniel took her to the creek where he'd first found her, showing her where to catch crayfish from under the rocks, how to check simple traps for rabbits and other small game. The creek was beautiful in daylight, the water clear and cold even in the summer heat, cottonwoods providing dappled shade. "This land isn't kind," Daniel said, watching the water flow past. "But it provides if you know how to ask properly. Just have to pay attention, learn to read the signs." Grace knelt by the water's edge, watching silver minnows dart between stones. Did Sarah like it out here? She felt Daniel tense slightly at the mention of his wife's name, but he didn't shut down the way she'd expected. Instead, he was quiet for a moment, then spoke. She did, actually. Grew up in St. Louis, all city comforts and society life. Her family thought I was taking her to hell when I brought her out to the frontier. A faint smile touched his mouth. But Sarah took to it, said she liked the honesty of it, the way things were what they were without pretense or performance. She sounds remarkable. She was. Daniel picked up a smooth stone, turning it in his hands. Smart, too. Smarter than me, certainly. She's the one who knew which plants were safe to eat, which herbs could treat common ailments. I just followed her lead and learned what I could. Grace heard the love in his voice, clear and unmistakable, even years after loss. She wondered if she'd ever be loved like that, with such certainty and depth. Thomas Brennan certainly hadn't loved her. She understood that now. Could see his pretty words for the empty promises they'd been. Her father's love had been conditional, based on her conformity to his expectations. But Daniel's love for Sarah had been the real thing, the kind that survived death and lived on in small moments of memory. "Do you think you'll ever marry again?" The question escaped before Grace could stop it. Daniel's hands stilled on the stone. He didn't answer immediately, and Grace began to regret asking. Then he spoke, his voice measured and thoughtful. "For a long time, I would have said no. Didn't see the point in opening myself up to that kind of loss again." He set the stone down carefully. "But lately I've been thinking maybe the real loss is in closing yourself off so completely that you never let yourself feel anything again." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and Grace felt her breath catch. There was something in his expression, not love, not yet, but the possibility of it, the acknowledgement that whatever was building between them had weight and meaning beyond simple practical arrangement. "Grace," he started, then seemed to think better of whatever he'd been about to say. "We should head back. Storm's coming." Grace looked up at the sky, surprised to see dark clouds building to the west. She'd been so absorbed in the conversation, in Daniel's proximity and the weight of unspoken things between them, that she hadn't noticed the changing weather. They walked back to the cabin in silence, but it wasn't the comfortable quiet of before. It was charged with awareness, with questions neither of them was quite ready to ask or answer. When they reached the cabin, the first drops of rain were beginning to fall, fat and heavy, splattering against the dry earth. Inside, Daniel built up the fire while Grace set about preparing dinner. They moved around each other in the small space with an ease born of routine, but Grace was hyper-aware of every moment their paths crossed, every accidental brush of hands or shoulders. The air felt thick with possibility and danger in equal measure. The storm broke in earnest as they sat down to eat, rain hammering against the roof, thunder rolling across the landscape. Grace had always loved storms as a child, the drama and power of them. But sitting here with Daniel, watching firelight play across his weathered features, she felt like she was in the middle of a different kind of storm entirely, one with no shelter, no safe harbor, only the choice to surrender to it or fight against inevitable force. After dinner, Grace returned to working on the Sparrow, while Daniel maintained his equipment, cleaning his rifle, sharpening knives, the endless maintenance that frontier life demanded. But Grace could feel his attention on her, could sense him watching when he thought she wasn't paying attention. Finally, she set down the carving and met his gaze directly. "What is it?" Daniel didn't pretend to misunderstand. "I've been thinking about what comes next, about what happens when the baby arrives." Grace's hand moved instinctively to her belly, which had grown noticeably rounder over the past weeks. "I've been thinking about that too. You'll need help, someone who knows about birthing babies. Someone who can assist when the time comes. I thought maybe the midwife in Sweetwater. Mrs. Patterson retired last year, moved to live with her daughter in Kansas." Daniel leaned forward, his expression serious. "There's a woman about a day's ride east, widow named Charlotte Reed, delivered most of the babies in this part of Texas. Good hands, kind heart. I thought maybe we could ride out there next week, introduce you, make arrangements." The practical concern in his voice, the way he was planning ahead, thinking through logistics, It was care expressed through action, and it made Grace's chest ache. "All right," she agreed softly. Daniel nodded, seeming satisfied, but he didn't lean back, didn't break the moment. Instead, he held her gaze, and Grace saw vulnerability there, carefully controlled but present. "Grace, I want you to know," he started, then paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. "Whatever happens, whatever you decide, you'll always have a place here. You and the baby, both. Not out of obligation or charity, but because—" He trailed off, jaw tightening. "Because why?" Grace whispered. Daniel was quiet for a long moment. The only sound was the rain on the roof and the crackle of the fire. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion barely contained. "Because this cabin was a tomb for 3 years, and then you stumbled into my life half dead and terrified, and suddenly I remembered what it felt like to care whether someone made it through another day. Suddenly I had a reason to fix things and plan for winter and give a damn about tomorrow." Grace felt tears burning behind her eyes. "Daniel, I'm not asking for anything," he continued, his words coming faster now, as if he had to get them out before courage failed. "I know you're young, I know you've been through hell, I know the last thing you probably want is another complication, but I need you to know that you matter, that this—" He gestured between them, encompassing the cabin, their shared routine, the fragile connection they'd built, "matters to me." Grace stood, her legs unsteady, and crossed the small space between them. She stopped just in front of his chair, close enough to see the silver in his hair, the lines around his eyes, the way his hands gripped the chair arms as if to keep himself anchored. "It matters to me too," she said quietly, "more than I know how to say." Daniel's eyes searched her face, looking for what? Grace wasn't sure. Truth, maybe. Certainty in an uncertain world. Whatever he found seemed to satisfy him because he reached out slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, and took her hand in his. His palm was rough and calloused, his grip gentle, despite the strength she knew resided there. Grace felt the warmth of his touch spread through her, grounding and electrifying her simultaneously. They stayed like that for a long moment, hands clasped, the storm raging outside, while inside something equally powerful, but infinitely more tender, took root and began to grow. The morning came cool and clear, the storm having washed the dust from the air and left everything sharp-edged and vivid. Grace woke to the smell of coffee and bacon, and for a moment before full consciousness returned, she simply lay there, feeling content in a way that seemed almost dangerous, given how quickly contentment could be stolen. When she emerged from the bedroom, Daniel was at the stove, his movements practiced and efficient. He glanced over his shoulder as she entered, and something passed between them, an acknowledgement of what had been said the night before, of the barrier that had been crossed when his hand closed around hers. "Morning," he said simply, as if everything hadn't changed. Maybe that was his way of giving her space, of not demanding that last night's intimacy carry forward into uncomfortable declarations or expectations. Grace appreciated it more than she could say. Morning. They ate breakfast with easy conversation about practical matters. The garden needing weeding, supplies that would need replenishing before winter, the trip to see Charlotte Reed that they'd discussed. Normal things, ordinary things, the kind of domestic planning that somehow felt more intimate than grand romantic gestures. After breakfast, Daniel announced he needed to ride out to check on some fence line that might have been damaged in the storm. "I'll be gone most of the day," he said, strapping on his gun belt. "You'll be all right here?" Grace nodded, though something in her chest tightened at the thought of him leaving. Foolish, she told herself. He'd been gone to Sweetwater just days ago, and she'd managed fine. But somehow after last night, after the vulnerability they'd both shown, his absence felt more weighted. Daniel must have seen something in her expression because he paused at the door. "I'll be back before dark, promise." And then he was gone, the sound of his horse fading into the distance, leaving Grace alone with her thoughts and the morning stretching ahead. She threw herself into work, attacking the cabin with cleaning fervor that probably wasn't necessary, but gave her hands something to do. She swept and scrubbed, organized and rearranged, anything to keep her mind from dwelling on the 1,000 questions that had taken root after Daniel's confession. What did it mean that she mattered to him? What was he offering exactly? And more terrifying, what did she want from whatever this was becoming? By midday, the cabin was spotless, and Grace's nervous energy had nowhere left to go. She made herself eat something, then settled at the table with the sparrow carving. It was nearly finished now, just small details remaining. Grace worked carefully, trying to capture the delicate structure of feet, the way the head tilted just slightly, as if listening for danger. She was so absorbed in the work that she didn't hear the rider approaching until the horse was nearly at the door. Grace's head snapped up, her heart jumping into her throat. Daniel wouldn't be back yet, which meant she grabbed the pistol from where she kept it nearby and moved to the window, staying back from the glass where she could see without being easily seen. The rider was a woman, Grace realized with surprise. Older, probably 50, wearing a practical split skirt for riding and a wide-brimmed hat against the sun. She dismounted with the ease of long practice and approached the door. Grace debated not answering, but the woman had clearly seen signs of life. The smoke from the chimney, the freshly swept porch. Hiding seemed pointless. She tucked the pistol into her pocket, kept her hand on it, and opened the door a crack. The woman smiled, and it seemed genuine rather than predatory. "You must be Grace. I'm Charlotte Reed." Grace blinked in surprise. "Mrs. Reed, but we were going to come see you next week." "Well, Daniel Bishop rode out to my place yesterday after he got back from Sweetwater. Said there was a young woman in his care who'd be needing a midwife come winter." Charlotte's eyes were kind, taking in Grace's obvious pregnancy without judgment. "Thought I'd ride out, introduce myself proper, make sure you're doing all right." Grace opened the door wider, though she kept her hand near the pistol. "Daniel's not here right now. He's checking the fence line." "That's all right. I came to see you, not him." Charlotte gestured to her horse. "Mind if I water my mare? It's been a dusty ride." Grace nodded, and Charlotte led her horse to the trough near the side of the cabin. When she returned, Grace had collected herself enough to remember basic hospitality. "Would you like some coffee or water?" "Coffee would be lovely, thank you." They settled at the table, and Grace found herself being assessed by eyes that had seen countless women in various stages of pregnancy and life crisis. But there was no condemnation in Charlotte's gaze, just professional interest and genuine warmth. "Daniel tells me you're about 6 months along now." Grace nodded, her hand moving instinctively to her belly. "I think so, maybe closer to 7. Charlotte sipped her coffee. "And you're feeling all right? No excessive swelling, no bleeding, no pains beyond the normal discomforts?" They talked through Grace's symptoms, Charlotte asking detailed questions with the ease of long practice. Grace found herself relaxing despite her initial wariness. There was something reassuring about Charlotte's competence, her matter-of-fact approach to what Grace had been taught to think of as shameful. "You're healthy," Charlotte said finally. "Baby seems to be doing well from what you're describing. We'll want to examine you properly closer to your time, but for now, just keep doing what you're doing. Rest when you're tired, eat regular, don't lift anything too heavy." Grace nodded, relief flooding through her. She'd been carrying a low-grade anxiety about the baby's health ever since her father had cast her out, wondering if all the walking and deprivation had caused some invisible damage. Charlotte refilled her coffee cup, then leaned back in her chair, her expression shifting to something more personal. "Can I speak plainly with you, Grace?" "Of course. Daniel Bishop is a good man. Lost his whole world 3 years back, and it damn near destroyed him. When he rode out to see me yesterday, asking about midwife services." Charlotte paused, choosing her words carefully. "That was the first time since Sarah and Caleb died that I've seen him planning for any kind of future. At first, he seemed to care about tomorrow, beyond just surviving until it arrived." Grace's throat tightened. "He's been very kind to me." "Kind?" Charlotte smiled slightly. "That's one word for it. Daniel doesn't do anything by half measures. If he's decided you matter, if he's brought you into his home and his life, then you matter completely. You understand what I'm saying?" Grace met the older woman's eyes. "I think so." "Do you? Because that man has built walls around himself that would put a fortress to shame, and somehow you've gotten past them. Charlotte's expression grew more serious. I'm not asking about your intentions or judging your circumstances. Lord knows we've all made choices that didn't turn out how we planned. I'm just saying, be careful with him. He's survived more than most people could, but I'm not sure he'd survive being abandoned again. The weight of that responsibility settled heavy on Grace's shoulders. She wanted to protest that she wasn't planning to abandon anyone, that if anything, she was the one who'd been abandoned, who knew how that felt and would never inflict it on someone else. But the words stuck in her throat because the truth was more complicated. She hadn't chosen to be here, hadn't planned for any of this. What if her feelings for Daniel were just gratitude or desperation, wearing the mask of something deeper? I care about him, Grace said quietly, more than I expected to, more than I probably should given how young I am and how recently we met. But I don't know what I can promise beyond that. Charlotte reached across the table and squeezed Grace's hand. Nobody's asking for promises, child, just honesty, with him and with yourself. She stood, draining the last of her coffee. I should get going. Got 2 other women I need to check on before dark. Grace walked her to the door, then on impulse asked, what were they like? Sarah and Caleb? Charlotte paused, her hand on her horse's reins. Sarah was sunshine, if sunshine could take human form. Always had a kind word, always saw the best in people. And Caleb, her expression softened. That boy was pure joy, curious about everything, always asking questions, always wanting to understand how things worked. She swung up into the saddle with practiced ease. Daniel lost the best parts of himself when he lost them, but maybe he's starting to find new parts, different parts. Maybe that's what you're helping him do. Charlotte rode off, leaving Grace standing on the porch with those words echoing in her mind. The afternoon sun was warm on her shoulders, and somewhere in the distance she could hear birds calling to each other, the world continuing its ordinary business, while inside Grace's chest something profound was shifting. She returned to the cabin and picked up the sparrow carving. Her hands worked automatically, adding the final details, smoothing rough edges. The bird was complete now, wings folded but somehow suggesting the possibility of flight. Head tilted in that characteristic alert posture. Grace held it in her palm, feeling the weight of it, the warmth of wood shaped by careful attention. Daniel returned as the sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon. Grace heard his horse and came to the door, watching as he dismounted and began unsaddling. He looked tired, dust-covered, but when he saw her standing there, something in his expression lightened. Everything all right? He asked, carrying his saddle toward the small shed. Yes, Charlotte Reed came by. Daniel stopped mid-stride, then continued walking. Did she now? What did she think? She said the baby's healthy, said I'm doing well. Grace paused. She also told me about Sarah and Caleb, about what they were like. Daniel's shoulders tensed slightly, but he didn't turn around. He finished storing his saddle, then stood there for a long moment, his back to Grace, his hands resting on the shed's doorframe. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough. I don't talk about them much, not because I don't think about them. I think about them every damn day, but because talking makes it real in a way that hurts worse than just carrying it silent. Grace stepped off the porch and crossed the distance between them. She stood just behind him, close enough that she could have touched him, but giving him space. Charlotte said you lost the best parts of yourself when they died. She's probably right. Daniel exhaled slowly. I was a different man before, lighter somehow, easier with laughter, quicker to trust. Sarah used to tease me about being too soft, said I'd give away our last dollar to anyone with a hard luck story. He finally turned to face Grace. After they died, I couldn't afford to be soft anymore. Soft meant vulnerable, and vulnerable meant more opportunities for the world to hurt you. Is that why you came out here? To get away from being vulnerable? Partially. Also because I couldn't stand being in town, walking past places we'd been together, seeing other families intact while mine was ashes. His jaw tightened. And because part of me felt like I deserved to be alone, like maybe if I'd been a better husband, a better father, a better protector, they'd still be alive. Grace's heart clenched. Daniel, you can't think that. What happened wasn't your fault, wasn't it? His voice was harsh now. years of self-recrimination bleeding through. I went to town that day for supplies. Could have gone the next day or the week after, but I went that specific day, left them alone, and that was the day those bastards decided to raid homesteads in the area. He turned away again, his hands curling into fists. I got back and the house was burning. Could see the smoke from half a mile away. Rode hard as I could, but by the time I got there, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Grace could imagine it too well. The destroyed home, the bodies, the moment when everything Daniel had built and loved was revealed to be already lost. I found Sarah first, Daniel continued, his voice barely above a whisper. She'd been shot. Quick at least. She wouldn't have suffered long. He swallowed hard. Caleb was in his room. They'd locked him in, probably while they ransacked the house. He'd died from the smoke, trying to get out through the window that was too small for him to fit through. Grace felt tears streaming down her face. Daniel, I buried them on the hill behind where the house used to stand. Said words I barely remember. Then I burned what was left of the house down to the foundation because I couldn't stand the thought of those walls still standing when the people who'd lived inside them were gone. He finally turned to face her, and Grace could see tear tracks through the dust on his face. After that, I came here, built this cabin, told myself I'd never care about anything enough to hurt that badly again. But you do care, Grace said softly. You care about me, about the baby. I know, Daniel's voice broke slightly. And it terrifies me, Grace, because caring means risk, means opening myself up to the possibility that I might lose you both the way I lost them, that I might fail to protect you, that I might come home one day to find. He stopped himself, shaking his head. But I can't seem to stop myself from caring anyway. Can't seem to keep the walls up no matter how hard I try. Grace closed the distance between them and did something she'd never dared before. She wrapped her arms around Daniel's waist and pressed her face against his chest. For a moment he stood rigid, uncertain. Then his arms came around her, holding her with a desperate gentleness that made her cry harder. They stood like that for a long time, two broken people clinging to each other against the indifferent vastness of the Texas frontier. Grace could feel Daniel's heart beating against her cheek, could feel the way his hands gripped her, as if she might disappear if he loosened his hold. And in that moment, she understood with absolute clarity that whatever was between them wasn't just gratitude or desperation or convenient timing. It was real, messy and complicated and terrifying, but real. When they finally pulled apart, the sun had begun to set, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Daniel's hands lingered on Grace's shoulders, his thumbs tracing small circles that might have been unconscious or might have been deliberate. I can't promise I won't fail you, he said quietly. Can't promise that loving you won't end in loss the way it did before. But I can promise that as long as I'm breathing, I'll do everything in my power to keep you and that baby safe. The word loving hung in the air between them, bold and undeniable. Grace felt her breath catch, felt the weight of it settling over her like a blanket. He loved her, this man who'd closed himself off from the world, who'd survived unimaginable loss and built walls around his heart. He loved her. Daniel, she whispered, her hands moving to rest against his chest. I'm 16 years old. I'm pregnant with another man's child. I have no money, no prospects, no family that wants me. You could do so much better than... Don't, his voice was firm but gentle. Don't diminish yourself or what we have by listing reasons why it shouldn't matter. It does matter. You matter. And that baby, he moved one hand to rest gently against her swollen belly, is going to need a father. Someone who'll protect them, teach them, love them as if they were blood. Grace's vision blurred with fresh tears. You'd do that? Raise another man's child? That baby is yours. That makes them mine too if you'll have me. Daniel's expression was fierce, certain, leaving no room for doubt. I'm not asking you to make any decisions right now. You're young. You've been through hell. You need time to figure out what you want beyond just surviving. But I need you to know, when you're ready, if you're ever ready, I'm here, not as charity or obligation, but because I want to be. Grace stood on her toes and kissed his cheek, a brief press of lips against weathered skin that somehow felt more intimate than anything she'd experienced before. "Thank you," she whispered against his ear, "for seeing me, for wanting me, for making me feel like maybe I deserve to be wanted." Daniel pulled back just enough to look at her, his grey eyes serious. "You've always deserved to be wanted, Grace Holloway. Your father was a fool for not seeing it. That Brennan boy was a coward for running from it. But I see it, and I'm not going anywhere." They stood in the fading light, holding each other, and Grace felt something she hadn't felt in so long she'd almost forgotten what it was called: security. Not just the physical safety of shelter and food, but the deeper security of being known and chosen anyway, of having someone look at all your broken pieces and decide you're worth keeping. That night, after a simple dinner neither of them had much appetite for, Grace sat by the fire while Daniel worked on repairing a harness. But the easy silence of previous evenings had been replaced by an awareness that crackled between them like electricity. Every glance felt weighted, every accidental touch meaningful. Grace picked up the completed sparrow, turning it in her hands. "It's finished," she said softly. Daniel looked up from his work. "So it is." "I thought—" Grace hesitated, then stood and crossed to where he sat. She held out the carving. "I thought maybe you should give this to someone who needs to know they're remembered." Understanding dawned in Daniel's eyes. He took the sparrow carefully, his thumb tracing the careful lines of feathers Grace had carved. "For Caleb, he would have loved this. Or maybe it's for you," Grace said quietly. "A reminder that birds stay even in winter, that some things endure even when everything else flies away." Daniel's eyes found hers, and what passed between them needed no words. He stood, setting the sparrow carefully on the mantel where the firelight would catch it, where it would be visible every day, a memorial and a promise, grief and hope carved into wood by hands learning to care again. "Grace," Daniel said, turning back to her, "I know I'm asking a lot, asking you to build a life out here with a man twice your age, in a place that's harsh and unforgiving, asking you to trust me when trust has been used against you before. But I'm asking anyway, because I think maybe we could both use a second chance at something good." Grace looked at this man who'd saved her life, who'd given her shelter without demanding payment, who'd killed to protect her and cried while telling her about his dead son. This man who somehow saw past her shame and her fear to something worth loving. "I don't need time to know what I want," she heard herself say. "I want to stay. I want to build something here with you. I want this baby to know a father who will love them no matter what. I want—" Her voice broke slightly. "I want to stop running and start living." Daniel's hands came up to cup her face, gentle despite their calluses and scars. "Then stay, live. Let me love you both properly the way you deserve." And there, in that small cabin, with the fire crackling and the night pressing close outside, Daniel Bishop and Grace Holloway made their promises to each other. No preacher, no witnesses, no formality. Just two damaged souls choosing each other against all reason, deciding that maybe survival wasn't enough anymore. Maybe they both deserved something more. Maybe they both deserved to be happy. 3 weeks later, Grace stood in front of the small mirror Daniel had hung in her bedroom, studying her reflection with something approaching wonder. The hollow-cheeked, desperate girl who'd collapsed by the creek was gone, replaced by someone who looked almost healthy. Color had returned to her face, her body had filled out with regular meals, and her belly had grown round and prominent with the advancing pregnancy. But the changes went deeper than physical recovery. There was something different in her eyes now, a steadiness, a quiet confidence that came from knowing she had a place in the world, not a temporary refuge or grudging charity, but a home, a future. She smoothed down the new dress she'd made from the fabric Daniel had brought from Sweetwater, simple cotton in a soft blue, cut generously to accommodate her changing shape, her first real project with needle and thread, and while the stitching wasn't perfect, there was satisfaction in having created something with her own hands. From the main room came the sounds of Daniel preparing breakfast. Grace smiled at the familiar rhythm of it, the clatter of the skillet, his quiet humming of a tune she'd never heard him sing with words, the smell of coffee strong enough to wake the dead. These small morning rituals had become precious to her, markers of a life built from routine and care. She emerged from the bedroom to find Daniel at the stove, as expected, but what she hadn't expected was the way he turned and stopped mid-motion when he saw her, the spatula frozen in his hand. "You made a dress," he said, stating the obvious because apparently coherent thought had temporarily fled. Grace felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I did. Do you like it? Grace, you could wear a flour sack and I'd think you were beautiful." Daniel set down the spatula and crossed to her, his hands reaching out then stopping just short of touching, as if asking permission. "But yes, I like it very much." Grace closed the distance herself, taking his hands and placing them on her waist. Over the past weeks, they'd grown more comfortable with casual physical affection. A hand on the shoulder in passing, fingers brushing as they worked side by side, the occasional embrace when emotions ran high. But there was still a carefulness between them, a mutual awareness that Grace was young and pregnant and had been hurt by men before. Daniel's thumbs traced small circles against her sides, his touch gentle. "You're feeling well today? Better than well. The baby's been active this morning. I think they're excited about something. Maybe they know today's important." Daniel's expression grew more serious. "Are you sure you want to do this? We can wait if you're having second thoughts." Grace shook her head firmly. "No second thoughts. I want to do this today." Today they were riding to Sweetwater, to the small church where the circuit preacher held services once a month. And there, in front of whatever congregation showed up, and God himself if he was paying attention, Daniel Bishop and Grace Holloway were going to be married. It had been Grace's idea, actually. 2 weeks ago, lying in bed, unable to sleep, she'd realized that she wanted the formality, wanted the public declaration. Not because she doubted Daniel's commitment or her own, but because she wanted the world to know that she'd been chosen, that someone had looked at her with all her baggage and brokenness and decided she was worth keeping. Daniel had agreed immediately, though he'd warned her that it wouldn't be a grand affair. No fancy dress, no elaborate celebration, just simple words spoken in a humble church. Grace had assured him that was exactly what she wanted. Honesty and simplicity, the kind of wedding that matched the life they were building together. They ate breakfast, then Daniel went to saddle the horses, while Grace gathered the few things they'd need for the journey. The ride to Sweetwater would take most of the morning, giving them time to reach the church before the service started at noon. Grace was securing a bundle to her saddle when Daniel appeared with something in his hands, a small bouquet of wildflowers he must have picked that morning before she woke. Nothing fancy, just prairie flowers in shades of yellow and purple, tied together with a piece of twine. But the gesture made Grace's throat tight. "Thought you should have flowers," Daniel said, almost shyly. "Sarah always said a wedding needed flowers." Grace took the bouquet carefully, bringing it to her nose. The flowers smelled of sunshine and open spaces, of a land that was harsh but could still produce moments of beauty. "They're perfect, thank you." They mounted up and rode out, the morning cool and pleasant, the sky stretching endless and blue overhead. Grace had become a competent rider over the past weeks, Daniel having taught her with the same patient thoroughness he brought to everything. Now she sat her horse with confidence, keeping pace with Daniel as they followed the rough trail toward town. They rode in comfortable silence for a while. Then Daniel spoke. "I've been thinking about names for the baby." Grace glanced over at him, surprised. They'd talked about practical preparations, where the baby would sleep, what supplies they'd need, when to fetch Charlotte Reed, but they hadn't discussed names yet. "What were you thinking?" "Well, if it's a boy." Daniel paused, his jaw tightening slightly. "I thought maybe Caleb, if that's not too painful, if you think it's appropriate." Grace felt her eyes burn with sudden tears. Daniel offering to name her baby after his lost son was perhaps the clearest declaration of love and acceptance he could make. It said that he was claiming this child fully, bringing them into his heart and his history without reservation. "I think that would be beautiful," Grace managed. "Caleb Holloway Bishop, it has a nice sound to it." Daniel nodded, seeming satisfied. "And if it's a girl? I was thinking maybe Rose. My mother's name was Rosemary, but everyone called her Rose." Grace paused. "Rose Bishop, what do you think?" "I think it's perfect." Daniel guided his horse closer to Grace's, reaching over to take her hand. "I think we're going to be all right, Grace. All three of us." Grace squeezed his hand, believing him. They rode on, and with each mile that passed, Grace felt lighter somehow, as if she were leaving behind not just physical distance, but emotional weight as well. The girl who'd been cast out by her father, who'd walked until she nearly died, who'd been saved by a stranger with his own demons. That girl was still part of her, would always be part of her, but she was becoming someone else too, someone stronger, someone loved. Sweetwater appeared on the horizon around mid-morning, a small collection of buildings huddled against the vast landscape. As they rode down the main street, Grace was aware of people stopping to stare. A pregnant girl riding alongside Daniel Bishop, both dressed in their best clothes, heading toward the church. It didn't take a genius to figure out what was happening. Grace lifted her chin and met their stares directly. Let them look, let them whisper. None of it could touch her anymore because she knew her own worth now, knew that whatever judgments these strangers might pass meant nothing against the solid certainty of Daniel's love. They tied their horses outside the church, a simple white structure with a small steeple. Other people were arriving too, families in their Sunday best, older folks moving slowly up the steps, children running and playing in the yard. A few nodded to Daniel, curiosity clear in their expressions when they noticed Grace at his side. Inside, the church was plain but clean, wooden pews arranged in neat rows, sunlight streaming through windows that had somehow survived intact in this rough frontier town. The circuit preacher stood at the front, a middle-aged man with kind eyes and work-worn hands. He looked up as Daniel and Grace approached, his expression registering surprise. "Daniel Bishop, didn't expect to see you here. Reverend Matthews?" Daniel's hand found the small of Grace's back, a steadying presence. "This is Grace Holloway. We'd like to be married today if you're willing." Reverend Matthews studied them both for a long moment. Grace could see him taking in her obvious pregnancy, her youth, the way she stood close to Daniel, as if drawing strength from his proximity. Whatever judgment he might have passed remained unspoken. Instead, he simply nodded. "I'll need 2 witnesses. I'll stand witness." Charlotte Reed's voice came from behind them. Grace turned to see the midwife standing a few pews back, a warm smile on her face. "Been waiting to see this day come, and I'll be the other." A man Grace didn't know stepped forward, older, with a weathered face and a gentle manner. Martin Fletcher, known Daniel for years. "Be honored to witness this." Grace felt gratitude wash over her for these people who were willing to stand for them, to validate their union in front of a community that might otherwise dismiss it as scandalous or inappropriate. Reverend Matthews gestured for them to come to the front of the church. "We'll do this before the regular service," he said. "Give the congregation something joyful to celebrate." People filed into the pews, whispers rippling through the gathering as they realized what was about to happen. Grace saw a few disapproving looks, heard scattered murmurs that might have been criticism or might have been simple curiosity. But she also saw Charlotte's encouraging smile, saw Martin Fletcher's approving nod, saw a few other faces that held nothing but goodwill. Daniel stood beside her at the altar, solid and steady as bedrock. When Grace's hands began to tremble, he took them in his own, his grip warm and certain. And when Reverend Matthews began to speak, his voice filled the small church with words that had been said countless times before, but somehow felt brand new. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here in the sight of God and these witnesses to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony." Grace barely heard the opening remarks. She was too focused on Daniel, on the way he looked at her like she was something precious, like she mattered more than anything else in the world. This man, who'd lost everything and rebuilt himself into someone who could love again. He was choosing her, not out of pity or obligation, but because he wanted to. "Marriage is not to be entered into lightly," Reverend Matthews continued, "but reverently, deliberately, and in accordance with the purposes for which it was instituted by God." Grace thought about her father, wondered if he would consider this marriage valid given her circumstances. Then she dismissed the thought. Her father's opinion no longer held power over her. This moment was hers, and Daniel's alone. "Daniel Bishop, do you take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love, and to cherish till death do you part?" Daniel's voice rang clear and firm. "I do. And do you, Grace Holloway, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish till death do you part?" Grace met Daniel's eyes and saw her future written there, a life built on honesty and care, on shared work and quiet companionship, on the kind of love that showed itself in actions rather than empty words, a life that would be hard sometimes, that would demand everything she had to give, but that would be hers in a way nothing else had ever been. "I do," she said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. "Do you have rings?" Reverend Matthews asked. Daniel reached into his pocket and produced 2 simple bands of hammered silver. He'd ridden to Sweetwater 2 days ago specifically to purchase them, though he'd tried to pretend he was just checking on supplies. Grace had known the truth, had seen the way he came back with a small wrapped package he wouldn't show her. Daniel slipped the smaller band onto Grace's finger, his hand steady despite the emotion Grace could see flickering in his eyes. Then Grace took the larger band and placed it on Daniel's finger, a visible symbol of their commitment, of the life they were promising to build together. "By the power vested in me by the territory of Texas and Almighty God, I now pronounce you husband and wife." Reverend Matthews smiled. "Daniel, you may kiss your bride." Daniel's hands came up to cup Grace's face, gentle as always, giving her every opportunity to pull back if she wanted. Instead, Grace leaned in, closing the distance between them. The kiss was soft and sweet, nothing passionate or demanding, just a tender meeting of lips that felt like a promise being sealed. When they pulled apart, the small congregation erupted in applause. Not everyone was clapping. Grace could see a few stiff faces, a few people who clearly disapproved, but enough were celebrating that the sound filled the church with warmth and approval. Charlotte was beaming, tears streaming down her face. Martin Fletcher was grinning like a fool, and Daniel was looking at Grace like she'd just given him the world. They signed the marriage certificate after the service, Grace's hand shaking slightly as she wrote her name. Grace Bishop now, no longer Holloway. A new name for a new life. Charlotte and Martin signed as witnesses, and Reverend Matthews added his official seal. "Congratulations," the Reverend said, handing Daniel the certificate. "May God bless your union with love and happiness." Outside the church, several people approached to offer their congratulations. Most were genuine, though a few had that particular smile that suggested they were filing away details for future gossip. Grace didn't care. Let them talk. She was married now, legally and morally protected in a way she hadn't been before. And more importantly, she was loved. Charlotte pulled Grace into a warm embrace. "I'm so happy for you both. You deserve every bit of joy you can find in this world." "Thank you for being here," Grace whispered, "for standing for us. Wouldn't have missed it." Charlotte pulled back, her expression growing more serious. "Now you listen to me, Grace Bishop. You're going to make a fine wife and mother. Don't let anyone tell you different. And if you ever need anything day or night, you send Daniel to fetch me. Understand?" Grace nodded, too emotional to speak. Martin Fletcher shook Daniel's hand with obvious warmth. "About time you came back to the land of the living, my friend. Sarah would be happy to see you moving forward." Daniel's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "Thank you, Martin, for everything." They stayed for the regular service, sitting together in the back pew, Daniel's arm around Grace's shoulders, her hand resting on his knee. The sermon was about redemption, about second chances, about how God's grace could transform even the most broken situations into something beautiful. Grace wondered if Reverend Matthews had chosen the topic deliberately, or if it was simply providence. After the service, they declined invitations to join families for Sunday dinner. Grace was tired, the emotional weight of the morning catching up with her, and she could see that Daniel was equally ready to return to the quiet of their cabin. They mounted their horses and rode out of Sweetwater as husband and wife, the sun high overhead, the day stretching warm and golden before them. They were perhaps halfway home when Grace felt it, a sharp flutter in her belly, stronger than the usual movements. She gasped slightly, one hand going to her stomach. Daniel reined in immediately, concern flashing across his face. "What is it? Are you all right?" Grace laughed, the sound surprised and delighted. "The baby. It's kicking, really kicking this time, not just flutters? Daniel dismounted and came to Grace's side, helping her down from her horse. His hand replaced hers on her belly, pressing gently. For a moment there was nothing, then another strong kick that made Daniel's eyes go wide. "Lord," he breathed, that's really something. Here." Grace took his hand and moved it to where the baby seemed most active. "Can you feel it?" Another kick, strong enough that Daniel could definitely feel it through Grace's dress. His expression transformed into something Grace had never seen before. Wonder mixed with joy, mixed with a fierce protectiveness that took her breath away. This man, who'd buried his own child, was feeling her baby kick, was claiming this new life as his own, was choosing to hope again despite all the reasons fear might seem more reasonable. "Hello in there," Daniel said softly, speaking to Grace's belly. "I'm your father. Been waiting to meet you, little one. Got a lot to teach you once you get here." Grace felt tears streaming down her face, but they were happy tears this time. Daniel looked up at her, and without a word, she knew he was crying too. Two people who'd been broken by life, who'd been cast aside and left for dead in different ways, standing on a dusty road in the middle of nowhere, crying together over the miracle of new life. Daniel pulled Grace into his arms, careful of her belly, and held her close. "We're going to be all right," he repeated, the words becoming something like prayer. "All of us, I promise." Grace held him tight, believing. They stood like that for a long time, the horses waiting patiently nearby, the sun warm on their shoulders, the vast Texas landscape stretching endlessly in all directions. The same landscape that had nearly killed Grace now seemed full of possibility. The same isolation that had been Daniel's prison now felt like sanctuary. Eventually they remounted and continued home, but something had shifted, some final piece falling into place. They weren't just two people sharing space anymore, or even just two people who'd decided to build a life together. They were a family now, Daniel and Grace and the baby who would arrive come winter, who would be loved and protected and raised to know their worth. When the cabin came into view, Grace felt her heart swell with a feeling she'd thought she might never experience again. Home, not just a place, but a belonging, not just shelter, but sanctuary. The cabin where Daniel had brought her half dead, where he'd nursed her back to health, where they'd learned to trust each other, and eventually to love. It was home now, in every sense that mattered. Daniel helped her down from her horse, and they stood together looking at the small structure that held their entire world. "It's not much," he said quietly. "Not fancy or impressive, but it's ours. It's perfect," Grace corrected, "because it's where we choose to be, together." They went inside, and Daniel built up the fire while Grace put away the marriage certificate in the small wooden box where they kept important papers. When she turned back, Daniel was standing by the mantel, looking at the carved sparrow they'd made together, the one that represented loss and survival in equal measure. "I was thinking," he said slowly, "that maybe we should carve another bird, one for this new beginning." Grace came to stand beside him. "What kind of bird?" "I don't know yet. Maybe we start cutting and see what emerges." Daniel smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face into something younger, lighter. "We've got time to figure it out together." Together. The word echoed through Grace's heart, resonating with everything it meant and promised. She took Daniel's hand and led him to the table where they'd sat so many evenings before, where they'd learned each other's stories and stitched together a future from the tattered remnants of their pasts. Daniel pulled out the block of wood he'd been saving, and Grace fetched his knife. They sat side by side, and Daniel made the first cut, then handed the knife to Grace so she could make the second. Back and forth they worked, their hands passing the knife between them, rough wood slowly revealing something new beneath. Outside, the afternoon faded toward evening. The fire crackled warmly, and in that small cabin on the Texas frontier, Daniel and Grace Bishop began the work of building their life together, one careful cut at a time, one shared moment at a time, one act of love and faith at a time. The sparrow on the mantel watched over them, a reminder of survival through harsh winters, and the new carving taking shape beneath their hands promised something more. Not just survival, but flourishing, not just endurance, but joy, not just making it through another day, but actually living. Grace looked at her husband, at the man who'd saved her life and then given her a reason to live it. And she smiled. She was 16 years old, 7 months pregnant, married to a man twice her age, living in a rough cabin in the middle of nowhere with winter coming on. And she had never been happier, because she'd learned the truth that some people never discover, that home isn't about fancy houses or perfect circumstances, or the approval of people who don't matter. Home is about being known and loved anyway. Home is about having someone who sees all your broken pieces and helps you arrange them into something beautiful. Home is about choosing each other every single day and meaning it. Daniel's hand covered hers on the knife, guiding the next cut. His shoulder pressed against hers, warm and solid and real. The baby kicked again, as if joining in the work, as if already part of this family they were building from hope and determination and love. "Welcome home, Grace Bishop," Daniel said softly, and Grace, for the first time in her life, truly was. "Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us."